Welcome to Victorian Britain, the land of lace, lunacy and limitless ambition, where every handshake was an audition and every teacup was a prop in the grand performance of respectability. It was an empire of contradictions, half moral sermon, half social masquerade. On paper, the Victorians were the world's model of propriety, upright, God-fearing, industrious, and just a touch self-satisfied. In practice, they were a nation collectively engaged in one of history's longest-running costume dramas. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Social climbing wasn't just a hobby, it was practically the national sport. The British Empire had stretched across the globe, and so had its hierarchy, from the polished mahogany drawing rooms of Mayfair to the smoky back streets of Manchester. Everyone, from dukes to dustmen, knew exactly where they stood on the social ladder, and more importantly, where they wanted to stand next. You weren't living in Victorian Britain unless you were also pretending to be slightly richer, cleaner, or more educated than you actually were. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Suddenly, wealth could be manufactured rather than inherited. A man could make a fortune in coal, cotton, or railways, but money alone didn't buy you class. You might have owned 10 factories, but if your wife still said ain't, or you accidentally used the wrong fork, society would collectively faint. The old aristocracy viewed new money like it was a contagious disease, interesting, profitable, but best observed from a distance. So the newly rich had to learn the delicate art of pretending to be old money, talking slowly, dressing stiffly, and decorating their homes with portraits of ancestors who didn't exist. In Victorian Britain, appearance was everything, some moral appearance, social appearance, even an architectural appearance. If your conscience wasn't spotless, your curtains had better be. Whole neighbourhoods were built as monuments to upward mobility, rows of identical houses with names like Prospect Villa or Rosebank Cottage, desperately pretending they were country estates instead of terraced clones with good lighting. Inside, parlours became shrines to self-presentation, piano in the corner, even if no one could play, family Bible on display, preferably dusted, and photographs of relatives arranged to suggest a history of refinement rather than a recent acquaintance with bankruptcy. Respectability, that favourite Victorian word, was a kind of social currency, intangible, fragile, and more valuable than gold. It didn't matter if your fortune came from mining soot or selling soap, as long as you behaved like your ancestors had never worked a day in their lives. And soap. The British middle class perfected the art of living on display. There were rules for everything: how to enter a room, how to sit, how to laugh. Quietly, of course, as though joy itself were vulgar. Even grief had a manual. Mourning was timed, dressed, and accessorized to ensure your sadness was socially acceptable. But the obsession with appearance went far beyond the parlour. Even servants joined in the performance. In a grand household, the butler held his nose a little higher than the footman. The cook terrorised the maids, and the maids bullied the scullery girl, proving that no matter how low you started, there was always someone beneath you to look down on. Status trickled downward like bad tea, and everyone scrambled for a sip. At the top of this grand pyramid sat Queen Victoria herself, the woman who defined an era by accident. She embodied the empire's contradictions, conservative yet progressive, moral yet sentimental, adored yet feared. Her name became shorthand for an entire moral code, one that valued self-control, decency, and the ability to pretend that unpleasant realities like poverty, sex, or the Irish question simply didn't exist. To be Victorian was to believe that even your furniture should have a conscience. Yet beneath the polished veneer of manners and morality, Britain was a cauldron of insecurity. Industrialization had created new wealth, but it had also created anxiety. Everyone wanted to be better dressed, better spoken, better born, or at least look like it. Respectability wasn't just about being moral. It was about being seen to be moral. Charity, religion, even hobbies became performances in the great theatre of upward mobility. The result? A society of chronic pretenders. The rich pretended to be noble, the middle class pretended to be rich, and the poor pretended not to be starving. A dinner guest might praise the host's fine china while mentally calculating how much it cost, and the host in turn might silently hope no one noticed the unpaid servants in the kitchen. Victorian life was one long balancing act between pride and panic. Of course, not everyone succeeded. For every social butterfly that flitted from obscurity to high society, there were dozens who crashed spectacularly. The wrong accent, the wrong handshake, or, heaven forbid, the wrong type of hat could undo years of careful posturing. A misplaced ain't could drop you down the class ladder faster than bankruptcy. So the Victorians learned to survive by pretending. Pretending to be calm, clean, cultured and unbothered, even while mortgaging the house to pay for a better one. They built their world on illusions polished to a shine, believing that if you acted like you belonged, eventually you would. It was a civilization run on good manners and quiet panics, a place where your worth could be measured by how convincingly you lied to yourself. Because in the age of pretending, truth was overrated. But a spotless reputation, that was priceless. If you wanted to witness the moment British society collectively lost its composure, you only had to step into the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring steam engines, soot, and the smell of progress. It blew up the entire class system like a faulty boiler. Suddenly, the social order that had stood for centuries, nobles on top, peasants below, everyone politely miserable in their proper place, was scrambled into chaos. A new species emerged, the ambitious, bewildered middle class. These were people who'd made their fortunes not from land, but from labour, or, more accurately, from making other people labour harder than ever before. Cotton mill owners, railway investors, shipping magnates, iron foundry lords, they were the new industrial aristocracy. They didn't inherit castles, they built factories. And while their bank accounts ballooned, their social skills did not. Money could buy them silk waistcoats and imported mahogany, but not the accent to pronounce mahogany correctly. To the old aristocracy, these upstarts were as terrifying as they were tacky. Imagine being a duke whose ancestors fought at Agincourt, now forced to dine beside a man who smelled faintly of coal and progress. The upper class clutched their pearl and their family crests, while industrial millionaires desperately tried to prove they were respectable. The result was a nationwide identity crisis conducted in lace collars and nervous laughter. The newly rich had everything except the one thing they wanted most: class. And in Victorian Britain, that wasn't something you were supposed to earn. You were supposed to be born leaking it. But the industrialists were nothing if not resourceful. If breeding was off the table, they'd buy everything else on it, literally. Dinner tables became the battlefields of social advancement, but before they could dine with dukes, they needed to understand the rules. Britain's social ladder was an unspoken, unforgiving code. A single misstep, using the wrong fork, sitting before a lady, or confusing the Earl of something with the Marquis of slightly more important, could destroy you. So they studied. Etiquette books sold like railway tickets. Finishing schools flourished. Entire families rehearsed polite conversation as though preparing for a royal inspection. Of course, most of this new middle class didn't come from refinement. They came from industry, from soot, noise, and relentless efficiency. Their daily lives had revolved around ledgers, not leisure, coal, not courtesy. But that began to change. The Industrial Revolution didn't just make money, it made mobility. Not trains, well, also trains, but social mobility. For the first time, ordinary people could move up in the world without the king's permission or a miracle involving inheritance and cholera. Take the archetypal Victorian success story, the self-made man. He started with nothing but ambition, luck, and possibly a small loan from a relative he'd later refused to acknowledge. He built a business, hired hundreds, and soon his chimney smoked beside the skyline of Manchester or Birmingham. But his new mansion, complete with marble fireplaces, mirrors, and Abvendenheits who judged his every decision, came with a new problem. Neighbours with pedigrees and opinions. Those neighbours spoke with vowels long enough to reach Scotland and knew precisely how to look bored without blinking. They hunted foxes, attended church in style, and could discuss poetry without accidentally mentioning profit margins. The factory owner, meanwhile, could calculate supply and demand faster than a bishop could say grace, but heaven help him if he buttered his bread the wrong way around. This was the beginning of the middle-class anxiety epidemic. Victorian manners became armour, and the Industrial Revolution was their forge, where aristocrats inherited confidence, industrialists manufactured imitation dignity. Everything had to signal refinement. The grand piano that no one played, the painting of a ship the owner had never sailed on, the imported wallpaper that matched the price of a horse. Even children became status symbols, educated in Latin, dressed in miniature frock coats, and raised to never speak of the family's factory origins. It wasn't just about fitting in, it was about survival. The Victorians believed morality and class were practically synonyms. A person of good breeding was presumed good in every other sense. Wealth without manners was vulgar, but poverty with politeness could still pass as virtue. And so the industrial middle class built not just mills and machines, but an entire culture of respectable performance. Cities like Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham became test grounds for this new identity. Elegant terraces sprang up beside smoky factories, their owners desperate to separate work from appearance. Industrial grime outside, imported carpets inside. Town halls and reading clubs emerged as temples of self-improvement. Men gathered to discuss literature they barely understood. Women attended lectures on refinement, all while quietly competing over who had the nicer tea service. And of course, religion helped glue it all together. The nonconformist work ethic merged beautifully with our middle-class morality. Industry was no longer just about profit, it was divine purpose. God apparently rewarded those who invested wisely. Sunday sermons preached that hard work, thrift and punctuality were the surest signs of grace, though the number of unpaid workers mysteriously omitted from those sermons could fill a hymn book. The irony was that while the middle class strained to imitate the nobility was secretly imitating them back. Aristocrats began investing in railways and factories, while industrialists bought country estates and shot pheasants they couldn't aim at. The lines blurred, the hierarchies twisted, and Britain became one enormous masquerade ball where everyone wore the wrong mask and hoped no one noticed. By the end of the century, the social ladder had turned into an escalator, powered by coal, fueled by anxiety. For the first time in history, class wasn't entirely determined by birth. It was determined by performance. You didn't need blue blood, just a spotless shirt, an expensive accent, and the conviction that you belonged somewhere higher than where you started. And thus, the Victorian middle class was born, ambitious, insecure, overdressed, and deeply committed to pretending taste could be acquired through effort and embroidery. Because while money couldn't buy class, in Victorian Britain it could certainly lease it, with an option to renew annually. If the Industrial Revolution gave Victorians money, the cult of appearances told them how to spend it. The era's unofficial motto might as well have been, if it looks respectable, it probably is. In a century where your worth could be erased by a muddy boot or a chipped teacup, appearances weren't decoration, they were defence mechanisms. Victorian life was a constant visual audition. From the moment you stepped outside your door, you were performing the part of a civilised, moral and entirely spotless human being. Cleanliness, tidiness and tasteful excess became the holy trinity of middle-class survival. Respectability wasn't something you had, it was something you wore, polished and dusted daily. At the centre of this obsession was the home, the ultimate billboard of who you were or desperately wanted to be. To step into a Victorian drawing room was to enter a museum of self-delusion. Heavy drapes, polished brass, and floral wallpaper so busy it could cause migraines were all meant to whisper, "Refined people live here." Visitors were expected to notice the spotless carpets and perfectly symmetrical furniture arrangement, not the owner's rising debt. Even the furniture had social anxiety. Sofas were covered in embroidered antimacassars to prevent hair oil stains, while parlours contained chairs no one was allowed to sit on. Too delicate, too expensive, too symbolic. A true mark of refinement wasn't how much comfort you owned, but how much discomfort you could afford. The poorer classes bought furniture to use. The middle classes bought furniture to prove they didn't need to use it. Cleanliness, meanwhile, became a religion. In a nation still covered in soot, Victorians worshipped at the altar of soap. Washing wasn't just hygienic, it was moral. A polished boot implied a polished soul. Housewives were expected to wage daily war against dust, grime and fingerprints, while gentlemen maintained gloves so white they could double as moral arguments. Laundry days were practically holy days, though for the servants who boiled, scrubbed and ironed for hours, they were closer to purgatory. For the aspiring middle class, visible cleanliness meant invisible sin. Moral worth was measured in starch. There was a common saying that soap is next to godliness, but in practice it ranked far above it. A spotless collar could redeem almost anything: debt, gossip, or even a slightly questionable business practice. Dirt, on the other hand, implied moral failure. The poor weren't just seen as unwashed, they were unworthy, and so began a nationwide panic to appear perpetually pristine. Windows gleamed, brass knobs shone, and even the family dog might get a weekly bath if he was lucky enough to belong to someone socially ambitious. The obsession extended to the streets. Towns installed gaslights not for safety, but so neighbours could admire how clean your curtains looked at night. The entire empire glimmered in a haze of polished vanity and industrial soap bubbles. Clothing, too, became an essential part of this grand visual lie. What you wore spoke louder than your birth certificate. For men, the key was restraint, tailored suits, perfect posture, and enough starch in your shirt to double as armour. For women, it was a battlefield of silk, lace, and bone-crushing corsets. A respectable woman's outfit was both a fashion statement and a moral one, modest, immaculate, and designed to suggest she had never done anything so vulgar as move quickly. Accessories became social language. A gentleman's hat signalled rank, his gloves signalled cleanliness, his cane signalled he could afford to carry something entirely useless. A lady's parasol wasn't for shade, it was for status. A pale complexion, achieved through powder and near asphyxiation from tight lacing, suggested she was far too refined to ever see the sun. In Victorian Britain, if you looked healthy, people assumed you worked for a living, social death sentence. But appearances went beyond fabric and furniture. They extended into behaviour. The true art of looking respectable lay in seeming effortlessly correct. A respectable person didn't shout, laugh loudly, or display emotion beyond mild amusement. Enthusiasm was gauche, composure was currency. Even walking became a performance, slow, straight-backed, and ideally beside someone of equal or higher status. If you looked calm, the world assumed your finances were too. Of course, this obsession with visual perfection was exhausting. Families spent fortunes they didn't have, maintaining illusions they couldn't afford to drop. Behind every spotless parlour was a sweating servant polishing it into submission. Respectability had a high maintenance cost, not just in money, but in nerves. The anxiety of appearing proper was enough to drive anyone to faint, which, conveniently, was considered fashionable too. Meanwhile, entire industries sprang up to feed the cult of appearances. Soap manufacturers, tailors, milliners and upholsterers became the silent saints of Victorian society. Advertisements promised instant gentility. Use this powder, wear this bonnet, polish this brass, and no one will suspect your father sold nails. Domestic advice books like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management taught readers how to curate not just their homes, but their public selves. Even morality was marketed as a lifestyle brand. For those who couldn't quite afford the look, imitation became an art form. The lower middle class mastered the illusion of wealth, fake marble, painted wood, imitation lace. Even wallpaper had social ambition printed to resemble silk damask or hand-painted frescoes. It was cheaper than owning a butler and much easier to dust. But perhaps the most tragic part of this cult was that no one ever felt they had achieved perfection. There was always a speck of dust left, a wrinkle out of place, a rival with slightly whiter gloves. The more Victorians cleaned, decorated and dressed themselves, the dirtier they seemed to feel inside. Respectability wasn't peace, it was paranoia with good lighting. Still, they persevered. Because in a world where reputation was everything, looking respectable was the difference between being invited to dinner and being whispered about afterward. You could be miserable, bankrupt, or trapped in a loveless marriage, but as long as your cuffs were white and your parlour curtains aligned, society would smile upon you. So they scrubbed, polished, starched, and smiled, determined to keep the great illusion alive. Because in Victorian Britain, appearances didn't just deceive, they defined. If Victorian Britain had a national sport, it wasn't cricket or croquet, it was manners. The 19th century saw the birth of an arms race fought not with muskets, but with teaspoons, curtsies, and crippling self-awareness. This was an age when the simple act of eating soup became an existential test. And the stakes? Your social survival. The old aristocracy had centuries of practice in behaving as though they owned the planet. The new middle class, however, needed instructions. Having money was one thing, knowing what to do with it in company was another. Thus, a new publishing phenomenon emerged, the Etiquette Manual. These books were part dictionary, part behavioural minefield, and part psychological warfare, and they sold faster than gossip in a drawing room. By the 1850s, manuals on manners were flying off the shelves, some earnest, others unintentionally hilarious. Titles like The Habits of Good Society or The Lady's Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness promised readers salvation from embarrassment. One could open the pages and learn how to address a bishop, fold a napkin, or stand near a duchess without breaking into a panic sweat. They were the Victorian equivalent of YouTube tutorials for surviving dinner with people richer than you. The queen of this booming business was Mrs. Isabella Beeton, the domestic oracle whose book of household management became a middle-class Bible. While most people know her for recipes and roast beef, Beeton's true genius lay in social choreography. She didn't just tell women how to cook, she told them how to exist, how to greet callers, seat guests, scold servants politely, and maintain an aura of dignity while quietly losing one's sanity under 15 layers of petticoats. But she wasn't alone. Dozens of etiquette prophets flooded the market, each declaring war on vulgarity. They dictated how one should eat and silently, speak briefly, laugh rarely, and sneeze, ideally not at all. Etiquette became a kind of moral math, a set of precise equations that, when followed perfectly, equalled respectability. And oh, how the Victorians calculated. The correct fork for fish, the correct handshake pressure, the correct number of seconds one should linger when bowing. The result was a society so paralysed by its own rules that even breathing required consideration. There were treatises on how loudly one might inhale tea vapour without appearing uncouth. If your spoon touched the cup's rim, you might as well emigrate. Dinner, especially, was a battlefield. There were entire pamphlets dedicated to navigating a multi-course meal without public humiliation. The Victorians ate in stages of mounting anxiety, from soup to pudding, each course another opportunity to disgrace oneself. And since many middle-class climbers had never grown up dining with servants or silverware, every gesture was a gamble. A misplaced napkin could undo months of pretending. Hosts weren't spared either. The etiquette of hosting became a nightmare wrapped in linen. There were rules about how to issue invitations, how many hours to wait before replying, what shade of ink to use, and whether the wax seal on your envelope was too assertive. Even arranging guests around a table required strategic genius. The wrong seating plan could ignite gossip so severe it needed its own sequel. Social calls were equally treacherous. The visiting card, a small rectangle of engraved paper, became the passport to social legitimacy. You couldn't simply show up at someone's home, you left your card first like an audition for friendship, and if they returned it folded a certain way, that meant you were approved. Folded another? Rejected. Etiquette was so convoluted that people needed etiquette books to understand other etiquette books. Men and women both suffered under the tyranny of politeness, but in different ways. For men, etiquette demanded quiet authority, a blend of firmness, good posture, and the ability to look deeply bored at all times. For women, it required an Olympic level of grace. A lady's worth could hinge on how she entered a room, curtsied, or pretended not to notice her corset was suffocating her. Public emotion was dangerous. Genuine enthusiasm could mark you as uncouth. A proper woman smiled faintly, like someone halfway through a polite haunting. What made Victorian etiquette truly absurd was that no one ever mastered it. There was always someone richer, grander, or smugger to correct you. The manuals never agreed with one another either. One advised shaking hands, another called it vulgar intimacy. One recommended bowing deeply. Another warned that doing so suggested continental looseness. It was like living in a perpetual etiquette exam graded by sadists with monocles. Yet the more impossible the rules became, the more people bought into them. Why? Because etiquette was the one arena where birth didn't completely dictate success. You couldn't change your bloodline, but you could train yourself not to clink your teacup. Manners were the camouflage of social ambition, proof that you could perform refinement as convincingly as anyone born to it. Of course, the true elites mocked the whole thing. Aristocrats prided themselves on ignoring the rules entirely. They were the standard after all. The irony was delicious. The nouveau riche were tying themselves into polite knots trying to imitate the nobility, while the nobility were off drinking port in their dressing gowns, laughing about it. Still, the Victorians believed. They believed that good manners could polish away class, that knowing the difference between how do you do and how do you do, sir, might open doors otherwise sealed shut. The manuals didn't just teach etiquette, they sold hope. Hope that with enough practice anyone could climb the ladder gracefully, silently, and with the correct teaspoon. By the end of the century, etiquette had evolved from social guidance into performance art. A person's ability to appear calm under the crushing weight of 400 social rules became its own form of prestige. To live in Victorian Britain was to be in constant rehearsal, forever adjusting gloves, posture, and vocabulary, because one slip could send you tumbling back into mediocrity. So they studied, practiced, and suffered beautifully, a civilization terrified of being impolite, yet obsessed with judging everyone else's attempts at politeness. In the end, etiquette wasn't about good behaviour. It was about belonging, and for the Victorians that meant playing the game, no matter how ridiculous the rules, with perfect posture and a smile that said, "I am absolutely fine, thank you. Please ignore the panic in my eyes." Beneath every polished Victorian mansion, every glistening chandelier and immaculately folded napkin, there was an entire hidden civilization, one powered by exhaustion, hierarchy, and sheer willpower. The servant class. They were the invisible gears that made the upper classes appear effortlessly elegant. But downstairs, below the fine rugs and forced smiles, was a world with its own rules, rivalries, and unspoken pecking orders. A social ladder so strict it made the upstairs look like anarchy. Victorian households were small kingdoms, and servants were its subjects. Except this monarchy had multiple monarchs, each convinced they were the true ruler of the kitchen empire. At the top of this domestic food chain stood the butler, the general of the downstairs army. Calm, grave, and slightly terrifying, the butler was both manager and gatekeeper. He controlled the wine cellar, the household accounts, and the delicate balance between upstairs chaos and downstairs mutiny. When a guest arrived, it was the butler's tone, posture, and eyebrow angle that told them whether they were truly welcome. The butler's uniform, always black, always pristine, was practically a suit of armour. He wasn't just serving drinks, he was embodying dignity. He represented the master, and heaven help him if he didn't. The perfect butler was invisible and omnipresent, capable of gliding silently across carpeted halls without disturbing a single dust mote. A good one could earn more respect than the master himself. After all, while a lord might inherit his title, A butler earned his authority, one perfectly polished spoon at a time. Just below him in the pecking order came the housekeeper, the iron-willed guardian of order. If the butler ruled the cellar, the housekeeper ruled everything that actually mattered, from the linens to the maids to the emotional stability of the household. She carried a ring of keys large enough to start a prison riot, and treated dust as a personal insult. To cross her was to risk social death, or worse, being reassigned to polishing the back stairs. She was often affectionately and fearfully called Mrs., regardless of whether she'd ever been married, a courtesy title earned by sheer endurance. Her ledger was her Bible, her feather duster, her sceptre. If the family's reputation depended on appearances upstairs, it depended on her judgment downstairs. She knew everyone's secrets, kept everything running, and had enough authority to make even the butler pause before criticising her. Then there was the cook, the culinary tyrant of the household. While the housekeeper maintained order, the cook ruled through terror and saucepans. She was the backbone of the household's social ambitions. Guests didn't remember polite conversation. They remembered whether the roast was overdone. A good cook could make or break a family's reputation faster than scandal. Some were treated like prized artists, others like kitchen dragons. Either way, no one argued with them, especially not the footman who risked being pelted with ladles for daring to breathe too close to the pudding. Beneath these mighty figures came the footmen, young men chosen for their height, looks, and ability to stand still for unnatural lengths of time. They were living decorations, hired to make door opening look aristocratic. Their powdered wigs and liveried uniforms made them walking advertisements for their master's refinement. But the job wasn't just for show. Footmen memorized hundreds of household rituals, from serving dinner in absolute synchronization to decanting wine without dribbling. One clumsy pour could ruin a career. If the footmen were the furniture that moved, the maids were the furniture that cleaned it. There were layers of them. Ladies' maids, parlour maids, housemaids, chambermaids, each with their own responsibilities and unspoken rivalries. The lady's maid occupied a privileged position, attending to the mistress directly. She knew her employer's wardrobe better than her employer did and guarded her confidences like state secrets. She might even accompany her lady on trips abroad, the Victorian equivalent of a glamorous internship in servitude. Parlour maids and housemaids, however, lived less enviable lives. Their days began before dawn and ended after midnight, filled with endless scrubbing, dusting and carrying. They were expected to be invisible, silent, efficient, and always cheerful, even when covered in soot. Upstairs, people liked to imagine the servants were part of the furniture. Downstairs, they were the furniture, just with better gossip. And then, the very bottom of this domestic ecosystem was the scullery maid, the lowest of the low, the martyr of soap and sorrow. Her world was the kitchen's back corner, where she spent her days scrubbing pots the size of bathtubs and polishing cutlery, till she could see her own misery reflected back. She was often just a teenager, paid next to nothing, working 16-hour days without ever glimpsing the drawing room she helped maintain. Her hands were raw, her back bent, and her dreams usually involved becoming someone else's kitchen maid, slightly higher on the ladder, slightly less miserable. And yet, despite the hierarchy's cruelty, there was order in it. And pride. Servants cared deeply about their rank. A footman would never stoop to help a scullery maid. That was beneath him. The cook wouldn't fetch her own ingredients. That was the kitchen maid's domain. Everyone had a place, and that place defined their identity. A butler who lost his position might as well lose his soul. Interestingly, many servants looked down on the people below them, just as fiercely as the aristocracy looked down on them. The ladder of servitude was a mirror of the society it served, everyone striving upward, terrified of slipping, quietly resenting the rung above. Even gossip followed the chain of command. Secrets flowed downhill, while complaints climbed up only if phrased in perfect humility. For the Victorian servant, life was an endless performance of obedience and endurance. Their work made the upper classes' lives appear graceful, but their own lives were anything but. Meals eaten in haste, rooms slept in shifts, wages delayed for months, all part of the invisible machinery that kept the illusion of gentility alive. And yet, within that machinery, they carved out community. Downstairs, laughter, storytelling, and even small rebellions thrived. A shared eye roll behind a master's back, a stolen moment of rest by the hearth. These were the quiet victories that made life bearable. Because in the grand pageant of Victorian society, not even the servants escaped the ladder. They just climbed it from the basement. And if you were lucky enough to reach the top, perhaps as butler or housekeeper, you might one day look back and think, with weary pride, you knew your place, and by God you earned it scrubbing someone else's. If the Victorians had gone to war with one another, and let's be honest, they sort of did, the battlefield would have been the ballroom, and the weapons would have been corsets, crinolines, and a terrifying number of hat feathers. Fashion wasn't just about looking good, it was about looking like you didn't have to do anything useful ever again. Victorian clothing was a language, and not a particularly subtle one. It shouted things like, "I'm respectable," "I'm wealthy," or occasionally, "Help, I've fallen into my own dress and can't get out." Every layer, every stitch, every absurd accessory told the world exactly who you were, or more often who you desperately wanted to be. Let's start with the corset, the iron lung of the 19th century. No self-respecting Victorian woman would be caught dead without one, though many were nearly caught dead because of one. Corsets were not just undergarments, they were declarations of status. The tighter the lacing, the higher the class, because breathing freely was for peasants and field workers. A waist so small it could balance a teacup wasn't a sign of health, it was a social trophy. If you could inhale without fainting, people assumed you weren't trying hard enough. But corsets were only the foundation. Above them, the true architectural wonders began, the crinoline, and later, the bustle. These weren't clothes so much as personal infrastructure. Early crinolines were massive bell-shaped cages of steel or whalebone, designed to make a woman's skirt wide enough to clear small furniture. Walking through a doorway became a strategic operation. Sitting was an act of faith. The sheer volume of fabric could take up an entire room, which was precisely the point. Space, in Victorian terms, was wealth. If your dress occupied half the parlour, it meant you didn't have to share it with anyone who worked for a living. As the century went on, the shape shifted, literally. The bustle pushed everything backward, creating a rear silhouette so dramatic that it looked as though fashion itself were trying to escape the wearer. Caricaturists had a field day, but society took it deadly seriously. A well-dressed woman was both a sculpture and a spectacle. It was beauty through impracticality, an aesthetic philosophy that said, if I can't walk fast or breathe properly, clearly I'm doing something right. Men, meanwhile, had their own form of fashionable warfare. The Victorian gentleman dressed not for colour but for control. Gone were the flamboyant silks and velvets of the Georgian era, replaced by dark wool, starch and seriousness. The proper Englishman was a walking sermon in restraint. His tailor was his priest, his waistcoat, his creed. The modern suit was born out of this age, sober, uniform, and as emotionally expressive as a brick wall. But make no mistake, those immaculate cuffs and spotless boots were just as competitive as the ladies' crinolines. Every button was an act of defiance against manual labour. The motto of the Victorian wardrobe could have been, "Thou shalt suffer for status." Dressing well wasn't just expensive, or it was exhausting. Layer after layer of petticoats, drawers, corsets, chemises, bodices, overskirts, and outerwear created an outfit that required both strategy and staff. Women didn't so much dress as assemble. The morning toilette could take hours, and by the end of it, one looked elegant, faint, and ready to be admired from a safe seated distance. But fashion wasn't just personal, it was industrial. The explosion of textile mills and global trade turned clothing into a commercial empire. Cotton from India, silk from China, dyes from the colonies, Britain clothed itself in the spoils of empire. Entire cities like Manchester and Leeds thrived on textile production. What had once been handmade by local dressmakers was now a global operation, powered by the machinery and empire, stitched together with colonial ambition and unpaid overtime. Out of this chaos emerged a new breed of entrepreneurs, the fashion houses. Designers like Charles Frederick Worth, often called the world's first couturier, transformed clothing into art and marketing. Worth's designs were spectacles of excess, made for duchesses and debutantes who wanted to outshine the sun. His gowns were priced like carriages and took as long to produce. Women didn't just wear Worth, they advertised him, parading his name as proof that they were part of fashion's upper clergy. Of course, the imitation flourished. The middle class, forever chasing respectability, did their best to copy aristocratic styles, often disastrously. Synthetic dyes made once rare colours affordable, leading to an epidemic of aggressively purple gowns and acid green gloves. Cheap fabrics imitated silk badly, and lower-class women bought knockoff crinolines so flimsy they occasionally collapsed. Nothing says social aspiration like getting trapped inside your own petticoat. Accessories became another front in the war of appearances. Gloves, parasols, pocket watches, canes, hats, every detail mattered. A gentleman's top hat wasn't just headwear, it was social armour, raising him literally and figuratively above the crowd. A lady's gloves told you whether she was married, mourning, or merely pretending to be both. The fan, meanwhile, became an entire language of flirtation. One misplaced flick could signal either, "I adore you," or "you smell faintly of fish." And the fashion industry itself became an endless feedback loop of desire and debt. Women spent fortunes chasing trends that changed every season. Dressmakers and milliners worked around the clock to keep up, often under grim conditions. Behind every glittering gown was a workshop full of overworked hands and overused needles. Respectability, as always, came at someone else's ascendancies. Yet, for all its absurdity, Victorian fashion did exactly what society demanded. It separated people. It turned class into costume. The wealthy and the ambitious could be identified from across the street, their status stitched into every seam. To dress well was to declare war on mediocrity, to fight daily for the illusion of superiority. And while the styles changed, from enormous skirts to bustles to tightly tailored gowns, one rule never did. Suffering looked spectacular. The more you endured, the more you impressed. The Victorians may have invented many marvels, the steam engine, photography, antiseptics, but their true innovation was managing to make discomfort look divine. Because in Victorian Britain, fashion wasn't self-expression, it was self-preservation. And if you could still breathe, well, clearly you weren't rich enough. If there was one arena where Victorians proved their worth or died trying, it was the dinner table. To modernise, a dinner party might sound like a cosy evening of laughter, food and mild gossip. To a Victorian host, however, it was a high-stakes social tournament, part theatre, part war, and part slow-motion financial suicide. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a statement, and every element – menu, wine, decor, seating, conversation – had to scream one thing: I belong among the important people. The dinner party was the social event that could make or break an entire family's reputation. It was where fortunes were flaunted, alliances forged, and subtle humiliations dished out between the soup and the second course. One wrong move, a wilted lettuce leaf, an unpolished spoon, a guest of lower status seated too close to the top of the table, and the ripples of embarrassment could last for months. Victorians didn't cancel people on social media, they did it with menus. The ritual began long before the first guest arrived. Invitations were issued with military precision, embossed cards on thick cream paper, delivered by hand at the proper time of day, worded with just the right amount of pretension. A single misplaced comma could make a family look ill-bred. Declining an invitation was even trickier. Too quick and it seemed rude, too late, and it hinted you were waiting for a better offer. Even stationery carried moral weight. Cheap ink suggested cheap morals. Then came the house itself. A true hostess didn't just prepare food, she prepared atmosphere. Drawing rooms were dusted until they could blind guests under gaslight. Silver was polished to an operatic shine, and servants were rehearsed like actors. Even the flowers mattered. Fresh blooms whispered wealth, while wilting arrangements hinted at financial decay. The dining room became a stage, and the table its battleground. And what a battlefield it was. The table setting resembled a small architectural project. Plates, glasses, and cutlery formed elaborate geometries that could rival military formations in complexity. Each utensil had its own purpose, and God help the poor soul who mistook a fish knife for a butter spreader. Napkins were folded into precise shapes, swans, lilies, or sometimes just subtle warnings of the chaos ahead. Centerpieces were absurdly grand, crystal epergnes spilling over with fruit, flowers, and occasionally flames. Candles were unpredictable companions. Victorian menus were exercises in both excess and endurance. A respectable dinner began with soup, preferably clear enough to see your shame in, followed by fish, entrees, roasts, game, puddings, sweets, cheeses, and finally, fruit and nuts. That's right, at least 9 courses, not counting the port and regret that followed. Dishes bore French names that few guests could pronounce, which was part of the fun. Saying potage à la reine with confidence was as good as having a noble title. The food itself was a declaration of class. Imported delicacies, truffles from France, oranges from Spain, turtle soup from the Caribbean, proved you had both connections and a complete disregard for local budgets. A middle-class host might bankrupt themselves on one evening's menu, all for the chance to impress a minor baronet who'd forget their name by dessert. Even the wine list was a political statement. The correct sequence, white before red, young before old, light before heavy, had to be followed religiously. Misjudge it, and your guests might whisper you were new money, or worse, colonial. Servants, meanwhile, orchestrated this culinary ballet with terrifying precision. Footmen in matching livery moved like synchronized ghosts, removing plates and refilling glasses without ever acknowledging they existed. The butler stood guard at the head of the table, managing the flow of wine and conversation alike. A single dropped fork could earn a glare so cold it could chill the soup. Conversation was as carefully curated as the cutlery. Guests were seated by rank and gender, the highest ranking woman beside the host, the most important man beside the hostess. Talk had to be lively but never loud, intelligent but never challenging. Politics, religion, and unpleasant truths, like poverty or industrial accidents, were strictly banned. Suitable topics included travel, hunting, music, and how lovely the weather was for people with servants to shovel it. For the truly ambitious, dinner was a competition. Who could secure the most fashionable guests? Who had the better china? Who managed to serve a pheasant that wasn't secretly undercooked? The upper middle classes and the nobility duelled in etiquette and gastronomy. Each evening, a bid for social ascendancy. Hosting the right people in the right order could vault a family up the social ladder. Inviting the wrong person, or worse, forgetting to invite the right one, could send you plummeting back to obscurity. And heaven forbid something went wrong. A collapsed soufflé could inspire scandal. A late arrival could spark whispers about impropriety. There are stories of women fainting from corset compression mid-dinner and being discreetly dragged under the table so the conversation could continue. Even fire hazards weren't off the menu. Gas chandeliers occasionally exploded, providing what some guests called unexpected after-dinner entertainment. But for all the anxiety, a successful dinner party was worth it. If your roast was perfectly timed, your claret decanted at the right temperature, and your conversation suitably boring, you earned social capital. Invitations to grander houses followed, and soon your name appeared in the gossip columns beside those who actually mattered. The Victorians might have believed in merit, but only the kind served on china. Beneath the silver and civility, though, dinner parties revealed something profound about the era. The desperate need to perform. Every gesture, from the placement of a fork to the arch of an eyebrow, was a signal in the complex dance of steus. The dinner table was where ambition met anxiety, and where entire reputations could be digested or destroyed. The industrial age might have built factories and empires, but its real innovation was the art of social theatre. And nowhere did that art shine brighter or burn faster than under the flickering candlelight of a Victorian dinner party. Because in the end, dinner wasn't about food. It was about proving you could swallow pride, debt, and duck à l'orange with equal grace, and never ever spill the gravy. If there was one thing Victorians loved more than tea and hypocrisy, it was proximity to importance. The 19th century turned social climbing into a national pastime, and name-dropping became its most refined sport. In an age obsessed with pedigree and appearance, a single well-placed name could open doors faster than actual competence ever could. Forget merit. What mattered was who you dined near, written to, or possibly stood beside once at a railway platform. For the ambitious Victorian, names weren't just conversation, they were currency. Knowing the right people, or at least pretending to, could elevate you from obscure respectability to whispered prestige. And so a nation of eager social mountaineers began sprinkling their conversations with noble titles like seasoning. A casual mention of the Duchess of so-and-so could transform a merchant into a man of discernment, while a reference to Dear Lady W, such a charming woman, suggested you had been in rooms where the wallpaper cost more than your salary. Of course, most of these connections were about as genuine as a porcelain teacup made in Birmingham and sold as continental. Victorians developed a collective talent for exaggeration so elaborate it bordered on art. A middle-class family might claim an ancestor who once served a noble household. Then by the next generation, that ancestor had miraculously married into it. By the time the grandchildren were grown, the story would feature an entirely fictional baronet and a conveniently missing family portrait. Name-dropping was an act of performance as much as deception. It wasn't enough to mention someone important. You had to do it with style. The trick was to make it sound accidental, as though dukes and viscounts naturally crossed your path while you were out shopping for sugar. Oh yes! I was just saying to Lord Chatterley last week that the weather has been dreadful for pheasants, one might remark, despite the fact that Lord Chatterley had never heard of you, and the only pheasant in your house was embroidered on a napkin. There was a delicate hierarchy to whose names were worth dropping. Royalty, of course, was gold. If you'd ever glimpsed Queen Victoria through a fogged carriage window, you could live off that anecdote for years. The aristocracy came next, earls, baronets and viscounts, all fair game for the conversational inflation. Below them were the titled gentry, military officers and famous authors. Quoting Dickens badly at dinner could still elevate you above your station, provided you didn't admit you were reading him in serialized installments rather than bound volumes. This obsession with association extended into marriage markets. Ambitious families sought to attach themselves, however tenuously, to nobility. Mothers became genealogical strategists, arranging introductions like military manoeuvres. Daughters were paraded at social events with pedigrees memorized and rehearsed. My great-uncle was acquainted with the Bishop of Bath, while fathers quietly exaggerated their income to suggest estates that didn't exist. The era's matrimonial ambitions could have filled libraries with fiction. Even business benefited from a good name. Merchants branded their shops with aristocratic echoes. Windsor Drapery, the Royal Tea Emporium, Victoria & Sons. Tailors advertised by appointment to His Grace, whether His Grace had ever been within smelling distance of their premises. If your business could suggest royal patronage, you didn't just sell cloth, you sold class. In a world where perception was power, the implication of nobility was often more profitable than the real thing. Then there were the social climbers of literature and letters, people who understood that intellectual association could substitute for birthright. Citing a conversation with a poet, real or imagined, or referencing a visit to a famous salon could lend instant polish. Even claiming to correspond with a bishop or natural philosopher gave the impression of cultured importance. Some ambitious Victorians carried notebooks of famous quotations, not to reflect wisdom but to borrow it. But name-dropping wasn't just about boasting, it was also a survival skill. The middle class lived in constant fear of being mistaken for the wrong sort, and dropping a famous name into conversation acted like a verbal perfume masking the smell of commerce. It reassured listeners that you too belonged to the great social orchestra, even if your role was more triangle than violin. Of course, not everyone was fooled. The old aristocracy could spot a false claim faster than a hawk spotting a nervous rabbit. There was a particular silence, the kind that follows a forced mention of my friend the Marquis, that could freeze a room solid. Real power didn't advertise itself, it simply existed, quietly, like a chandelier that never needed polishing. But the climbers couldn't help themselves. Silence was unbearable when status could be performed through speech. The newspapers only fueled the mania. Society columns breathlessly reported who had attended which ball, who had dined where, who had stood beside whom at a charity bazaar. A single mention of one's name in print, no matter how minor, was worth more than gold. It was social validation in ink. Some people even sent in false notices about their own appearances, hoping readers would assume proximity to prestige meant participation in it. The phenomenon reached its comedic peak in drawing room conversation, where introductions became competitive. A newcomer might say, "I once dined with Sir Robert Peel." The response? "Ah yes, such a man. I remember my father corresponding with him about a railway proposal." Neither statement was verifiable, and both parties knew it. The game wasn't about truth, it was about style. The goal was to seem connected without ever being called upon to prove it. At its heart, yes, name-dropping revealed the Victorians' greatest insecurity, their awareness that status was fragile. The industrial middle class had bought their way into visibility, but not legitimacy. Aristocrats had titles, industrialists had dinner invitations. To bridge that gap, words became weapons. Each dropped name another rung on the social ladder, another patch on the disguise of gentility. And so the empire chattered on, a symphony of exaggerated acquaintances and borrowed glory. Behind every dropped name was a silent hope that someday someone would drop yours. Because in the Victorian social jungle, survival wasn't about who you were, it was about who you could convincingly pretend to know. If the Victorians could have built their self-worth out of bricks, they would have. And in fact, they did. The 19th century wasn't just the age of steam and soot, it was the age of architecture as ambition. The British middle class didn't merely want homes, they wanted monuments to respectability, carefully designed to tell the world, "We are refined, cultured, and absolutely not working for a living, thank you." The result? Entire neighbourhoods that looked like Gothic fairy tales designed by people who had never actually been in one. Step through the front gate of a newly built Victorian villa, and you'd enter a world where imitation was both art form and moral duty. The Industrial Revolution had filled bank accounts but emptied taste buds. Suddenly, thousands of people could afford houses far grander than their parents ever dreamed of. But grandeur is a slippery concept. Without centuries of aristocratic ancestry to guide them, the rising middle class did what any sensible climber would do. They copied everything. The rich lived in manors, so the middle class built smaller manors. The rich had libraries, so the middle class built libraries, often filled with decorative books that had never been opened. The architecture of aspiration became a national obsession. Across Britain, cities sprouted rows of Gothic revival villas, mock Tudor townhouses, and Italianate terraces, each one declaring, "I'm not nouveau riche, I'm medieval nouveau riche." These houses borrowed architectural styles the owners barely understood. Pointed arches, stained glass, and miniature turrets appeared in suburbs miles from the nearest castle. A wealthy mill owner in Manchester might have built himself a mock Gothic estate complete with battlements, because nothing says moral authority like pretending you could fend off a siege. Victorians believed architecture had moral weight. A well-built home wasn't just a structure, it was a sermon in stone. Every gable, cornice, and balustrade was supposed to announce virtue. A symmetrical facade meant moral balance. Heavy drapes meant modesty. A grand front door said you paid your servants enough to keep quiet. There was a hierarchy to domestic space that mirrored society itself. The drawing room for showing off, the dining room for controlled anxiety, and the servants' quarters for human beings you pretended didn't exist. Inside these temples of aspiration, the parlour reigned supreme. It was the social stage upon which middle-class dignity was performed. Guests rarely saw the rest of the house, so every inch of the parlour was curated within an inch of its sanity. Tables groaned under the weight of porcelain figurines, lace doilies, and the occasional taxidermied bird staring at eternity in bewilderment. Walls were layered with patterned wallpaper, floral, damask, or occasionally both, fighting for dominance like rival dynasties. Every surface had to be filled, as if space itself were an enemy of virtue. Victorian taste revolved around abundance as proof of refinement. A bare room suggested poverty, or worse, modernity. The more cluttered the room, the more respectable the owner. Even the furniture had a moral dimension. Carved oak meant gravitas, mahogany meant success. Velvet meant you'd probably made your fortune in something unmentionable, but at least you had the decency to cover it in class. Of course, no respectable home was complete without its library, a room designed to suggest intellectual depth, even if the most challenging text inside was Mrs. Beeton's household management. Shelves groaned with matching sets of unread classics, bought by the yard from stationers who specialised in furnishing fake learning. Books weren't meant to be read, they were meant to be seen reading. A visitor catching sight of the works of Shakespeare on your table might assume you'd read them. Best not to ruin the illusion by accidentally quoting him wrong. The obsession with imitation extended to the smallest details. Fireplaces were framed with marble that wasn't marble, chandeliers made of glass pretending to be crystal, and paintings depicting bucolic scenes from countries the owners would never visit. Everything was borrowed grandeur, a performance of refinement with all the sincerity of a stage set. Even plants were pressed into service. Exotic ferns and palms, often wilting under coal dust, became symbols of taste and cultivation. Nothing said civilized quite like struggling flora. The hallway was another crucial battlefield. Since guests spent time there removing hats and forming first impressions, it had to strike exactly the right tone. Too bare, and it suggested stinginess. Too lavish, and it hinted at desperation. The perfect hallway combined authority with warmth, though, given the average Victorian's heating situation, warmth was usually more theoretical than real. Umbrella stands, gilt mirrors, and stiffly framed ancestral portraits, often purchased wholesale, announced lineage where none existed. Yet perhaps the strangest part of the Victorian home was its moral schizophrenia. The same people who filled their parlours with exotic trinkets from India and Egypt also preached about modesty and restraint. Respectability demanded that everything look proper, even if nothing actually was. Bedrooms were hidden from view, kitchens banished to the back, servants confined to staircases designed for invisibility. A guest could tour the house and come away convinced its owners lived in constant elegance, unaware that half the family was probably shivering in unheated rooms upstairs. The female touch was everywhere. Women were the curators of domestic virtue, their reputations entwined with the cleanliness of the curtains. A well-kept house reflected well on her character. A dusty mantelpiece hinted at moral decay. Home decor became a form of gendered performance. Women didn't just decorate, they purified. The ideal Victorian house was a museum of femininity, spotless, fragile, and faintly oppressive. Of course, not everyone admired the result. Critics like John Ruskin and William Morris began railing against this epidemic of faux taste, calling for simplicity, honesty, and craftsmanship. Morris famously declared, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." The problem was, Most Victorians believed everything was beautiful, especially if it came with tassels. In the end, the house that respectability built was less a home and more a confession. Every lace curtain and imitation column whispered insecurity. The Victorians weren't decorating for comfort, they were decorating for forgiveness. Forgiveness for being new money, for working, for rising too fast in a society that worshipped stability. Their houses were their alibis. Behind the velvet drapes and overstuffed furniture, they could pretend they were part of the timeless order of Britain's greatness. And so, room by room, brick by anxious brick, they built not homes but proof that they belonged. Every room screamed taste, which was ironic, because most of them had none left to spare. If modern romance is a matter of the heart, Victorian marriage was a matter of the ledger. For all their poetry and propriety, the Victorians treated matrimony less like an emotional union and more like a business acquisition, complete with negotiations, mergers, and ideally, minimal affection to confuse the paperwork. Marriage was where economics met etiquette, where dowries and family names were weighed like commodities on the stock exchange of respectability. In theory, the Victorians worshipped love, the novel said so. Poets sang about it, paintings romanticised it, and every other household had at least one sighing daughter clutching Jane Eyre. But in practice, love was what you hoped might appear after the financial terms were signed. The polite fiction of falling in love existed mainly to make social climbing look spiritual. Real Victorian marriage wasn't about butterflies. It was about banknotes, titles, and the desperate need to ensure no one married beneath their station, unless it came with enough money to cushion the fall. At the centre of this system stood the dowry, that delicate euphemism for financial incentive. A woman's fortune was her weapon, her bait, and her burden all at once. For middle and upper class families, daughters were strategic assets in the long campaign to secure prestige. A girl might be educated, charming, and vaguely musical, but the figure written in her father's will was the true measure of her allure. In a society that believed marrying well was the height of success, the dowry wasn't just a gift, it was an investment in the family's ongoing reputation. Mothers became the unofficial CEOs of this romantic economy. Their job was to scout, strategize, and secure. The matchmaking mother was the most determined creature in the Victorian wild, part diplomat, part spy, part military tactician. She manoeuvred her daughters into ballrooms, garden parties, and country weekends with the precision of a general planning an invasion. Every glance, every invitation, every accidental encounter by the refreshment table was calculated. She knew which families were overextended, which sons were secretly broke, and which titles were one mortgage away from extinction. And there were plenty of those. The late 19th century saw the curious phenomenon of the impoverished aristocrat. Noble families with long pedigrees and short purses, their estates were vast, their servants numerous, and their debts catastrophic. Industrialization had shifted the money elsewhere, into the pockets of merchants, bankers, and factory owners, people who were rich but tragically common. These two desperate worlds soon found each other across the ballroom floor. Thus began the great social transaction of the Victorian era, the title for money exchange. A penniless baron could marry a textile magnate's daughter, and suddenly both families got what they wanted. He received her father's fortune. She received his family name and enough heraldic credibility to wallpaper the drawing room. It was a mutually beneficial trade, one built on the polite understanding that neither party expected happiness. The newspapers called them good matches. The servants, less politely, called them financial rescues. But the arrangement wasn't limited to Britain. The late Victorian period brought the age of the transatlantic marriage, where impoverished British nobles crossed oceans in search of American dollars. The United States was bursting with industrial millionaires, men who made fortunes in railroads, steels, and oil. But American high society still lacked something priceless, the illusion of old-world legitimacy. British titles offered precisely that. Dozens of cash-strapped dukes, earls and lords found salvation in the form of wealthy American heiresses, young women with names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Drexel, armed with optimism, ambition, and luggage large enough to smuggle an entire coal mine. These dollar princesses, as the press called them, traded their fortunes for coronets. Their fathers gained European prestige, their husbands gained solvency, and the brides gained, well, a lifetime of formal dinners and British weather. One of the most famous of these unions was Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, a lavish ceremony that might as well have been labelled merger completed. Consuelo was reportedly miserable, but her dowry repaired Blenheim Palace's finances, and society declared the match a triumph. Love was conspicuously absent, but so were creditors, which in Victorian arithmetic amounted to the same thing. Even for the less glamorous classes, the same logic applied. Marriages were ladders to be climbed, not hearts to be shared. A middle-class clerk might marry the daughter of his superior to secure a promotion. A governess might dream of marrying into her employer's family, though that particular fantasy, immortalised by Jane Eyre, usually ended in social ruin or a nervous breakdown. For most women, marriage wasn't a choice but a career path. Spinsterhood was the ultimate failure, and the unmarried woman was treated as both a cautionary tale and an awkward dinner guest. The economics of marriage extended to the wedding ceremony itself, which became an increasingly elaborate advertisement for family prosperity. White dresses, once rare, exploded in popularity after Queen Victoria's 1840 wedding, when she made bridal purity fashionable and lace an industry. Middle-class brides followed suit, often bankrupting their families for the privilege of looking virginal in silk. No expense was spared. Multi-tiered cakes, orchestras, imported flowers, and enough tulle to suffocate a carriage horse. Guests weren't celebrating love, they were auditing success, and once the honeymoon was over, reality set in. Many marriages were cold partnerships maintained by duty, convenience, and the knowledge that divorce carried social disgrace. For men, infidelity was tolerated as long as it was discreet. For women, even suspicion could destroy their standing. Emotional distance was considered a virtue, proof that one's affections were under strict moral management. Yet, beneath the facade of marital stability, small rebellions brewed. Some women began questioning the system. Writers like George Eliot, Caroline Norton, and later the suffragists challenged the idea that marriage was a woman's destiny. They saw it for what it often was, a gilded cage with good upholstery. But such voices were rare, and for most Victorians, marriage remained the only acceptable form of social insurance. In the end, Victorian marriage was less about finding love and more about finding leverage. It wasn't a meeting of souls, but of social spreadsheets, where dowries replaced feelings and family names were traded like stocks. Because in the great game of respectability, love was optional, but social advancement, that was mandatory. If social climbing was an art in Victorian Britain, then its apprenticeships were held not in universities but in finishing schools, those genteel factories of pretension, where young people, especially young women, were polished, perfumed, and prepared to survive high society without accidentally sitting in the wrong chair or expressing an actual opinion. It was here that the rising classes learned the subtle skills of pretending to be cultured, skills that included walking like an angel, speaking like an encyclopedia, and looking genuinely riveted by Latin verse, even when your corset was slowly crushing the will to live. Victorian society demanded more than wealth. It demanded performance. Money could buy a carriage, but it couldn't buy the right way to step out of one. It could furnish a library, but it couldn't teach you to quote Milton without sounding like you'd just met him. Enter the educators of elegance, governesses, tutors, and finishing mistresses whose job was to turn awkward offspring of industrialists into passable imitations of the gentry. For girls especially, the finishing school became a rite of passage. The curriculum was less education and more social camouflage. Lessons in algebra or science were replaced with piano, French, embroidery, and moral philosophy. the latter often summarised as "don't make anyone uncomfortable by being interesting." The goal wasn't to fill the mind, but to smooth it into polite conversation. A well-finished young lady could discuss art without ever having seen any, speak French badly enough to seem refined, and faint gracefully on command. Deportment, that sacred discipline of posture and poise, was drilled daily. Girls balanced books on their heads to perfect the upright glide that signalled breeding and discouraged independent thought. They practised curtsies in front of mirrors until their knees learned the choreography of submission. Walking, sitting, even breathing were moral acts. To slouch was to reveal one's inner chaos. To move elegantly was to reassure the world that your soul, like your posture, was firmly under control. Conversation, meanwhile, was treated like fencing, delicate, precise, and potentially fatal if mishandled. There were manuals dedicated entirely to the art of conversation, warning against vulgar topics such as politics, religion, illness, or reality. A proper young lady was expected to be charming but not clever, witty but never funny, and enthusiastic only about things that didn't matter. For men, conversation training meant the opposite, sounding learned without ever sounding passionate. The goal was to seem as though you'd read everything but cared deeply about nothing. To perfect these social gymnastics, the Victorians invented conversation classes, early prototypes of small-talk torture sessions. Groups of young people were seated together under the watchful gaze of a tutor and encouraged to discuss safe subjects such as the weather, as travel, or the Queen's latest public appearance. Points were lost for hesitation, slang, or enthusiasm. An ideal conversationalist could talk for 20 minutes about wallpaper and still leave everyone convinced of their intellectual depth. For the sons of the ambitious middle class, the route to refinement was equally artificial. Young gentlemen were packed off to tutors and public schools where they were expected to absorb Latin, Greek, and a sense of superiority strong enough to last a lifetime. The classical education system didn't necessarily prepare them for real life, but it did teach them to drop ancient references in conversation. Nothing elevated a discussion about train schedules like a quote from Horace. Being able to recite a few lines of Virgil was the Victorian equivalent of name-dropping an Ivy League degree. And then there was elocution, a booming industry in the Victorian age. To the socially anxious, pronunciation was salvation. The ability to pronounce schedule like a gentleman rather than schedule like a tradesman could mean the difference between acceptance and exile. Elocution teachers flourished, offering lessons in the proper tone, the pure vowel, and the graceful utterance. Students were drilled to flatten their regional accents until they all sounded equally unplaceable, neither aristocrat nor pauper, but something aspirationally in between. Some went further still, attending cultural finishing tours, essentially education through tourism. Wealthy families sent their children across Europe to collect refinement the way others collected postage stamps. Paris provided fashion, Florence provided art, and Switzerland provided scenery suitable for watercolours. These trips were supposed to broaden minds, but mostly reinforced the idea that refinement was something you could import, like wine or wallpaper. By the time the young travellers returned home, they had learned little beyond how to pronounce Louvre correctly, and how to pretend to appreciate landscapes while secretly longing for tea. Of course, all this refinement came with a side effect: crippling self-consciousness. Victorians lived in terror of appearing vulgar, uneducated, or worst of all, middle class. The very lessons meant to liberate them often turned them into social contortionists. Every gesture, phrase, and facial expression had to be calculated. There are stories of dinner guests practicing smiles in mirrors to ensure they revealed just the right number of teeth. Genuine emotion became dangerous. Laughter too loud, sorrow too visible, curiosity too unbecoming. Refinement demanded repression. Yet behind all this theatricality lay something deeply human: insecurity. The Victorians were obsessed with class mobility but terrified of exposure. Finishing schools didn't produce cultured minds, they produced trained survivors, people who could pass in polite society without ever truly belonging to it. Refinement was camouflage for anxiety. elegance a shield against ridicule. Still, some graduates took their education to absurd extremes. Young women who had been trained to paint watercolour landscapes now competed to produce the most delicate, pointless art imaginable. Young men, armed with degrees in classics, entered professions where Latin was about as useful as embroidery. The system churned out people who could quote Virgil but couldn't boil an egg, who could waltz flawlessly but fainted at the sight of a tradesman. And that, in many ways, was the point. Victorian society didn't value knowledge, it valued the appearance of it. A person who looked cultured was as good as one who was. A person who could recite poetry was more valuable than one who could understand it. And those who could perform refinement convincingly enough were rewarded with the only diploma that mattered, social acceptance. By the end of the century, an entire generation of Victorians had mastered the delicate art of looking intelligent while saying nothing, looking noble while being nervous, and looking endlessly fascinated by Latin poetry while quietly wondering what it actually meant. Because in Victorian Britain, education didn't make you smarter, it just made you safer. One flawless curtsy, one rehearsed compliment, and one perfectly modulated indeed, quite so at a time. If money was the bloodstream of Victorian society, gossip was its nervous system, tingling, twitching, and overreacting at the slightest hint of impropriety. The 19th century was an age obsessed with reputation, and rumour was both the weapon and the battlefield. For the ambitious social climber, surviving the gossip gauntlet meant walking a daily tightrope of politeness and paranoia, where a misplaced glance could ruin a season, and a whispered accusation could undo a lifetime's worth of respectable dinner parties. The Victorian obsession with what people thought wasn't mere vanity, it was currency. You could lose your fortune and still recover, but lose your reputation and you were socially bankrupt. Character was the great moral myth of the age, but in truth it was just a brand that had to be maintained at all costs. Everyone, from duchesses to dressmakers, knew that gossip travelled faster than the railway and hit harder than a scandal sheet. And those scandal sheets, they were booming business. The Victorian press realised early on that nothing sold papers like other people's humiliation. By the mid-1800s, newspapers and society journals had turned gossip into an industry, complete with regular columns dedicated to dissecting London's elite. Titles like the Court Journal, the Society Herald, and the Town Talk offered readers a tantalising mix of half-truths, moral outrage, and just enough plausible deniability to avoid libel. They published coded references to a certain baronet's indiscretions, or a lady of distinction who ought to know better, and readers gleefully decoded them over breakfast. The upper classes pretended to hate this kind of journalism, but they read it religiously. It was the 19th century equivalent of doom scrolling, an irresistible mix of judgment, envy, and entertainment, all printed in respectable serif fonts. In London, gossip spread like fog, thick, constant, and impossible to contain. It flowed through drawing rooms, opera houses, garden parties, and gentlemen's clubs. Every whispered comment was potential ammunition. A hostess who accidentally snubbed a guest might find herself excluded from invitations for months. A woman who danced twice with the same man risked whispers of impropriety. Even the absence of gossip could be suspicious. It suggested you weren't interesting enough to be discussed. Servants, naturally, were the unseen couriers of this information network. While the upper classes pretended discretion, their maids, butlers, and coachmen traded secrets like currency. The backstairs and kitchens of London were alive with murmurs. Who had quarrelled, who had debts, who had been seen leaving whose carriage at what hour. By the time such tales reached the parlour, they had evolved from rumour to revelation. But the gossip economy wasn't confined to the aristocracy. The middle class, desperate to maintain respectability, became equally addicted. With morality as their favourite costume, they wielded gossip as both entertainment and enforcement. A neighbour's lapse in housekeeping or church attendance could become headline news on the street corner. The social hierarchy depended on shame to keep everyone in line, and gossip was its most efficient delivery system. A single misstep, a loud laugh, a late bill, a daring dress, could spark a cascade of whispers. And the problem with Victorian gossip was that it didn't have to be true, it just had to be believable. A woman seen walking unchaperoned might be labelled fast. A man who smiled too much at a married lady might find himself conveniently uninvited from every respectable gathering in town. The empire might have been built on steel and commerce, but polite society was built on innuendo. The courts even got involved. The new penny press had made public scandal more accessible than ever, and libel trials became theatre. Famous cases drew huge audiences, lords suing editors, actresses suing society women, clergymen defending their virtue with trembling hands and Latin quotations. Newspapers treated these trials like serialized dramas, feeding the public's insatiable appetite for moral collapse. Every time a respectable name appeared in print, 1,000 readers leaned forward to devour the details. For women, the stakes were brutal. A man could recover from scandal through charm or success. A woman could be socially erased. Even the mere suggestion of impropriety, real or imagined, could end her prospects forever. The fallen woman became a cultural obsession, moralized in novels, illustrated in magazines, and judged in parlours. The line between victim and villain was drawn by rumour, and it was rarely fair. Yet gossip wasn't only destructive, it was also social glue. It allowed Victorians to bond over shared judgment, to navigate class boundaries through information exchange. It gave people something to say when they weren't allowed to talk about anything real. "Have you heard?" was the most common prelude to a conversation, and the most dangerous. Even reformers weren't immune. Religious societies, temperance leagues, and charitable committees all had their own whisper networks. The same women who organised soup kitchens could ruin a rival's reputation between hymn verses. The Victorians might have prided themselves on moral restraint, but behind every sermon stood someone quietly taking notes for later. The late century brought a new terror: photography. For the first time, the faces of the powerful and scandalous could be circulated to the masses. Caricatures and satirical prints had always existed, but a photograph added terrifying proof. The Illustrated Weekly Punch perfected the art of polite ridicule, skewering politicians, socialites, and anyone foolish enough to make a public misstep. Being lampooned in its pages was both an honour and a humiliation. You were someone worth mocking. The cruel irony was that many Victorians secretly needed gossip. Scandal gave texture to lives constrained by etiquette and duty. It was rebellion by proxy, sin experienced safely through others. To gossip was to participate in the grand theatre of morality, condemning vice from a comfortable armchair while privately enjoying every sordid detail. In the end, gossip was both the bloodstream and the poison of Victorian respectability. It punished the ambitious, terrified the insecure, and enthroned hypocrisy as the highest virtue. The same society that preached discretion and modesty built its identity on public curiosity and private cruelty. And for those trying to climb the ladder, the message was clear. Your dress could be perfect, your manners flawless, your pedigree borrowed from the noblest of ancestors, but one misplaced word, one unguarded laugh, one whisper out of turn, and London would feast on your downfall before dessert. If modern society glorifies productivity, Victorian Britain glorified the appearance of doing absolutely nothing. In an age when the middle and upper classes defined themselves by what they didn't have to do, leisure became the ultimate luxury, a social performance so refined that it required planning, precision, and a small army of servants to maintain. The ideal Victorian gentleman or lady was never hurried, never visibly occupied, and never so vulgar as to seem useful. Leisure wasn't a break from work. It was a declaration that one's existence was funded by someone else's labour. In this upside-down moral economy, to work was a necessity. To relax beautifully was an art form. Having free time wasn't the goal, appearing serene while other people made that possible was. But make no mistake, leisure in Victorian Britain was hard work. The daily schedule of a fashionable household was a full-time occupation in itself, demanding stamina, wardrobe changes, and a mastery of polite endurance. A typical morning for an upper-class lady began with correspondence, a genteel term for sending notes she hadn't written, delivered by servants she hadn't hired, to people she didn't like. Then came breakfast, which she might pretend to eat, followed by hours of calls, brief social visits that consisted mainly of pretending to bump into people she'd already scheduled to see. By afternoon, she was expected to host or attend tea, that most sacred of rituals in the temple of idleness. Afternoon tea was less about refreshment and more about social choreography. The teacup itself was a test. Handle it incorrectly, and you might as well have dipped it into scandal. Biscuits were daintily nibbled, conversation delicately hollow. Tea was a battlefield where reputations were brewed, steeped, and sometimes scalded. For men, leisure came cloaked in the illusion of importance. The gentleman's club became his sanctuary, a cigar-scented fortress where business was discussed under the pretense of not working. Reading the Times for 3 hours counted as intellectual labour. Betting on horses was considered sporting insight. Leisure, for men, meant appearing thoughtful in a leather armchair, while delegating the empire's real work to clerks, servants, and colonial administrators several continents away. The Victorian elite had perfected the performance of idleness. It wasn't enough to do nothing. One had to do nothing elegantly. The body language of leisure was meticulously cultivated. Languid poses, soft laughter, and a look of faintly amused detachment, as if one's thoughts were perpetually elsewhere, preferably on a yacht. The concept of graceful waste ruled all. Time, money, and effort were to be expended lavishly on things that proved you didn't need to economise. Nowhere was this better displayed than in the great outdoors. Picnics, for instance, were a paradox of effort and idleness. What began as a spontaneous rustic outing quickly evolved into a logistical nightmare involving hampers, carriage cages, cutlery, and enough food to feed a regiment. Servants arrived hours in advance to set up tables and rugs so that their employers could pretend to rough it. Once everything was arranged, the guests would delicately complain about the sun, nibble a sandwich, and declare it delightfully simple. Nothing said luxury like performing poverty in silk gloves. When they weren't pretending to be at one with nature, Victorians entertained themselves indoors with parlour games, the backbone of polite amusement. These were not the raucous affairs of the working class, but carefully moderated exercises in decorum. Charades, 20 questions, and word games ruled the drawing room, offering an acceptable outlet for wit, so long as no one became too witty. The games were meant to fill silence without creating intimacy, to generate laughter without loosening corsets. They were the social equivalent of polite coughing. Even holidays were meticulously structured displays of leisure. The seaside, for instance, became a fashionable escape precisely because it was unproductive. Families paraded along promenades in layers of clothing completely unsuitable for sand, pretending to enjoy the bracing air, while secretly dreading the salt and gulls. Bathing machines, little wooden huts rolled into the water, allowed women to dip into the sea without the indignity of being seen enjoying themselves. Even fun required supervision. Behind all this effort lay a simple truth. Leisure was proof of class. The ability to be idle signalled that someone else was doing the work. The Industrial Revolution had flooded Britain with productivity, and the middle and upper classes responded by turning unproductivity into a status symbol. Time became the new wealth, and wasting it gracefully the highest art. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of leisure. The working classes, who cleaned, cooked, and laundered for the elite, lived in a state of permanent exhaustion. The same newspapers that published glowing reports of society picnics also ran grim statistics about factory deaths and child labour. But in the delicate moral mathematics of the Victorians, the industrious poor existed to make the idleness of the wealthy look noble. After all, someone had to make the sandwiches for the picnic. the obsession with leisure also spawned entire industries. Afternoon teas, country retreats, croquet sets, and travel wardrobes became economic engines in themselves. A lady could not simply go for a stroll, she required walking gowns, parasols, and the latest footwear from Regent Street. Gentlemen, meanwhile, amassed collections of canes, pipes, and hats, each symbolising a different shade of not working. The market for leisure accessories was so profitable that idleness practically became an investment strategy. Yet beneath all the etiquette and embroidery lay an anxious truth. Victorian leisure was performative, not pleasurable. It wasn't about rest, it was about reputation. People didn't relax, they posed for the idea of relaxation. A picnic was a photo opportunity, if photography had been fast enough. A tea party, a sermon in porcelain. To be visibly busy was vulgar. To appear effortlessly unbothered was divine. By the twilight of the 19th century, this philosophy of ornamental idleness was beginning to crack. The younger generation, inspired by art, literature, and a few scandalous Americans, began flirting with the idea that leisure could involve actual enjoyment. But for the true Victorians, leisure was never about happiness, it was about hierarchy. Because in a society obsessed with appearances, nothing said success like mastering the ancient and exhausting art of doing nothing beautifully. If the Victorian home was a temple to respectability, the gentleman's club was its secret chapel, an oak-panelled paradise where men could escape wives, responsibility, and the suffocating smell of virtue. London's clubs weren't just social venues, they were the beating heart of male exclusivity. Places where reputations were minted, cigars were worshipped, and gossip about ministers and mistresses drifted through the smoke like incense. Joining the right club didn't just make you respectable, it made you real. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire ran on mahogany and masculinity. The upper and middle classes had created an entire infrastructure of leisure, but the club was its crown jewel. Part living room, part parliament, part refuge from the relentless domestic empire ruled by women and etiquette. The very idea of a gentleman's club was built on contradiction. It promised privacy, but only for those so publicly important that they needed it. London alone boasted dozens of them, each more pompous than the last. The grand old Whites, founded in the 17th century, was the undisputed Olympus of exclusivity. To gain entry was to ascend socially and spiritually. The club's famed betting book contained centuries of wagers, ranging from political predictions to who might die first in scandalous circumstances. Inside its elegant rooms, members lounged in wingback chairs, sipped port and insulted each other in tones of exquisite politeness. Across town, Brooks's served as White's political rival and social twin, catering to Whigs and reform-minded aristocrats. But by the Victorian era, new clubs had begun springing up faster than etiquette manuals, each tailored to a specific flavour of pretension. There was the Reform Club for liberal politicians, the Carlton for conservatives, the Garrick for actors and writers, and the Athenaeum for intellectuals, or at least those who looked good pretending to be. If you could think of a human interest, vice, or obsession, there was a club for it. Getting in, however, was another matter entirely. Club membership was the purest form of social gatekeeping, a test of patience, pedigree, and personal recommendation. You couldn't simply apply, you had to be proposed, seconded, and then scrutinised by a committee of men who had nothing better to do than judge others' worthiness. One blackball, a single vote against you, could end your dreams of reclining in leather and superiority forever. For the successful applicant, acceptance was a metamorphosis. Overnight you transformed from that ambitious fellow from Manchester into a member of the Reform. Club membership acted as social shorthand, proof that you were the right kind of person, even if no one could quite define what that meant. To the Victorians, clubs were moral disinfectants. Once admitted, even your questionable origins seemed to smell faintly of respectability and cigar smoke. Inside, life followed a sacred rhythm. The club was part hotel, part sanctuary from hotels. Members arrived mid-afternoon, read the day's papers, dined on elaborate meals served by silent waiters, and retreated to the smoking room to discuss politics, investments, or who had most recently embarrassed themselves at Ascot. Conversation was a delicate balance between worldliness and boredom. Expressed too much enthusiasm, and you risked seeming common. Expressed too little, and you were suspected of thinking. The interiors were designed to soothe the conscience and flatter the ego. Thick carpets, velvet drapes, roaring fires, and endless portraits of dead white men created an atmosphere of timeless importance. Every surface smelled faintly of tobacco and self-satisfaction. The dining rooms served food that was hearty but never adventurous. Victorian men did not experiment with spices or emotion. The wine cellars were deep enough to hide several scandals, and the libraries were full of books no one read unless they were about hunting, empire, or ancient Rome. The cigars, however, were excellent. Smoking was practically a ritual, the slow-burning symbol of male authority. To light a cigar in a club was to reaffirm one's place in the hierarchy of calm confidence. The room would fill with fragrant smoke and low murmurs, the air thick with the reassuring knowledge that no woman could enter and no real work was being done. Indeed, that was the point. Clubs offered sanctuary from both labour and domestic life. Victorian wives managed households that ran like clockwork. Their husbands escaped to clubs that operated on perpetual delay. Inside, time moved at a gentleman's pace, measured not by minutes, but by how long it took to finish a drink or an argument about parliamentary procedure. The outside world was noisy, industrial, and democratic. The club was quiet, upholstered, and stubbornly hierarchical. And yet, clubs were more than idle retreats. They were engines of power. Political alliances were forged over brandy, colonial policies were debated between courses. Newspapers were born, literary movements conceived, even scandals plotted. All beneath chandeliers that had seen more secrets than confessions. The Victorian Empire may have been administered from Westminster, but it was imagined in the smoking rooms of Pall Mall. Naturally, this exclusivity inspired imitation. By the late 1800s, the club craze had trickled down to the middle class. Provincial towns opened their own miniature versions, gentlemen's institutes, and working men's clubs that replicated the rituals of belonging, minus the pedigree. Even women, tired of being barred from the mahogany sanctuaries, began forming their own clubs, literary societies, temperance leagues, and suffrage groups where tea replaced tobacco, but the ambition burned just as fiercely. Still, the men of London clung to their sanctuaries like relics of a fading age. The Industrial Revolution had filled the city with noise, factories, and nouveau riches, but the clubs remained temples of controlled tradition, unchanging, unevolving, and faintly ridiculous. To belong was to participate in a grand illusion that Britain's future could be managed by men reclining in armchairs, discussing empire between puffs of smoke. By the dawn of the 20th century, as suffragists marched and empires trembled, the club's power began to fade. But in their heyday, they represented everything the Victorian gentleman aspired to be: calm, comfortable, mirthful, connected, and conspicuously unconcerned with anything outside the club's front door. Because in the end, the gentleman's club wasn't about cigars or even conversation. It was about belonging without effort, snobbery upholstered in leather, idleness dressed in importance. And for a true Victorian man, there was no greater luxury than that. When Victorians packed their trunks and set off across Europe, it wasn't wanderlust that moved them, it was status anxiety. Travel for the respectable classes was never about discovery or delight. It was about display. Every railway ticket, hotel ledger, and passport stamp was a receipt of cultural superiority. In a century that prided itself on progress, travel became one more way to prove you were advancing, even if all you really advanced was your sunburn. By the mid-19th century, railways had turned Europe into a vast social stage. What had once been the exclusive domain of aristocrats, the elegant, expensive grand tour of continental Europe, was now available to the rising middle class. Steamships and trains made foreign travel faster, cheaper, and infinitely more crowded. Predictably, the upper crust reacted with horror. "The continent," one duchess reportedly sniffed, "used to be so exclusive until the railways let everyone in." But that didn't stop anyone. The Victorians descended on Europe like polite locusts armed with guidebooks and luggage. Every English traveller worth their monogram trunk aimed to return with two things: a tan, ideally mild and controlled, and a story about how disappointing foreigners were. As the saying went, the Englishman abroad takes his climate with him, cloudy and disapproving. The Grand Tour, a holdover from the 18th century, was originally designed to polish the manners of young aristocrats. It was meant to expose them to art, architecture, and sophisticated corruption before they inherited their estates. By the Victorian era, however, the tradition had morphed into something far more self-conscious. Now it was a competitive race of refinement, where families measured their worth by how convincingly they could admire Roman ruins while pretending not to notice the smell. Italy remained the jewel of the itinerary. Florence, Venice, and Rome promised art, history, and mild scandal, everything a Victorian traveller could appreciate from a safe emotional distance. But it wasn't enough to visit. One had to know how to visit. The guidebook industry flourished, with publishers like John Murray and Baedeker dictating which ruins to admire and in what order. These books were the Bibles of bourgeois travel, part itinerary, part instruction manual, and part moral lecture. Heaven forbid a tourist express enthusiasm for the wrong fresco. Travel etiquette demanded a particular type of performance, or tempered by superiority. One was expected to marvel at the Colosseum, but not so much that it suggested foreign culture might equal British civilization. The correct tone was weary admiration, the verbal equivalent of sipping tea while complimenting a rival's furniture. If one could complain about the Italian heat or the French manners in French, all the better. For those less inclined toward dusty ruins, there were spa towns, the respectable alternative to adventure. Places like Bath, Harrogate, and Baden-Baden became pilgrimage sites for those who wanted to improve their health, or at least pretend to. Mineral springs, hot baths, and tepid conversation were the order of the day. The typical spa experience involved sipping vile-tasting water while discussing its curative properties in tones of martyrdom. Illness was almost secondary to the performance of being delicately unwell. Spa life followed strict hierarchies. There were promenades for the wealthy, parks for the merely prosperous, and designated benches for the tragically middle class. The goal wasn't to heal, it was to be seen healing in the right company. Invalidism became fashionable, particularly among women. A fainting spell or nervous complaint could justify an entire season in a German spa town, complete with correspondence home about doctors' orders and the invigorating mountain air. Closer to home, seaside resorts became the great levelling ground of Victorian leisure. Towns like Brighton, Scarborough and Blackpool transformed from fishing villages into glittering and occasionally grimy centres of social display. Seaside fashion demanded its own wardrobe, its own rituals, and a great deal of restraint. Swimming, of course, was too indecent for polite society, hence the invention of the bathing machine, a wooden hut on wheels that allowed women to enter the sea without the public horror of being seen in reduced clothing. Men, meanwhile, strode the promenade in linen suits and hats, pretending to contemplate the horizon, while secretly ranking every other gentleman's walking stick. Couples strolled in perfect synchronization, children were displayed like accessories, and everyone discussed the weather as if it were a moral issue. The seaside was where the Victorians went to escape society, and promptly rebuilt it beside the water. Even abroad, the English maintained their empire of habits. Hotels in Switzerland served afternoon tea, French waiters learned to fake indifference in English. The British tourist was instantly recognisable, pale, polite, and perpetually unimpressed. Continental caricatures mocked them mercilessly, stiff-necked travellers with guidebooks in hand, forever seeking the English church and a decent cup of tea. And indeed, many brought their comforts with them. Some even shipped servants ahead to prepare lodgings, ensuring that the foreign experience would remain thoroughly domestic. For those of serious ambition, travel offered a new kind of social documentation. A well-travelled gentleman could sprinkle conversation with continental references. "Of course, one must see the Vatican to appreciate Michelangelo," he'd remark, knowing perfectly well that no one else in the room had. Possessing first-hand experience of Europe's great sights became another rung on the ladder of gentility. You could be poorly read, but being well-travelled suggested culture by osmosis. And naturally the Victorians kept souvenirs, tons of them. Trinkets, statues, fans, shells, and the occasional smuggled artefact cluttered parlours across Britain. A mantelpiece filled with objects from abroad announced one's sophistication, though it more often resembled a museum curated by someone with no taste and too much baggage allowance. Yet for all their pretense of sophistication, most Victorians abroad were homesick within a week. They missed the fog, the roast beef, the predictability of class distinctions. The foreign world was fascinating, yes, but it was also loud, emotional, and distressingly un-British. Many returned from the continent more convinced than ever that England was the moral and aesthetic centre of the universe. By the end of the century, the travel industry had fully industrialised. Thomas Cook's organised tours took even the timid into foreign lands, ensuring safety, decency, and a strict itinerary that allowed for no actual adventure. It was travel as social insurance, a guided march through culture, sanitised and respectable. So when Victorians declared they were seeing the world, what they really meant was that they were being seen seeing it. They didn't travel to change, they travelled to confirm that they were right all along, because nothing said refinement like standing under an Italian sun, fanning yourself with a railway timetable and sighing, "Yes, the ruins are lovely, but have you tried Brighton?" If Victorian Britain had one unspoken law stronger than the Queen's own word, it was this: conversation must never lead anywhere dangerous. In an age when social climbing required flawless composure, small talk wasn't just chit-chat, it was a survival mechanism. Every drawing room, dinner table and garden party was a verbal minefield, where one wrong remark could destroy months of careful reputation building. Speaking became an Olympic event, graceful, strategic and physically exhausting. Conversation in the 19th century was an art, and like all Victorian arts, it came with rules. Manuals on how to converse properly circulated almost as widely as prayer books. They taught readers how to sound intelligent without revealing actual opinions, a delicate dance between being too quiet and too clever. One popular guide, The Habits of Good Society 1859, solemnly warned, "In good conversation, it is better to know a little of everything than everything of a little." In other words, ignorance was fine, as long as you could disguise it with charm. The Victorians were terrified of awkwardness. Every sentence had to be calculated to fill silence without provoking emotion. Politics, religion, money, and illness were strictly banned. Death was acceptable only if it happened to someone sufficiently famous or fictional. The safest topics were weather, gardens, and the Queen, though even those could be risky if the Queen in question was in mourning, as she perpetually was. The middle and upper classes treated conversation like a card game played with wit instead of luck. You didn't talk to people, you performed at them. There was even a concept known as drawing room voice, a soft, elegant murmur designed to convey civility without clarity. Speaking too loudly marked you as vulgar. Speaking too softly made you mysterious and therefore suspicious. The goal was to seem engaged while saying absolutely nothing memorable. Manuals provided helpful examples of safe conversation starters. Do you find the weather agreeable this season? How is your dear aunt's health? Have you seen the new lamps on the Strand? Each was a masterpiece of polite emptiness, an exchange designed to last just long enough to avoid silence, but not so long that it risked sincerity. If your companion looked bored, congratulations, you were doing it correctly. For women, conversational decorum was especially fraught. A well-bred lady could be charming, even witty, but never assertive. Manuals warned against talking too much or, heaven forbid, expressing strong opinions. One etiquette expert gravely observed, "Ladies should be entertaining, but like a fire in a grate, warm yet contained." In practice, this meant a lifetime of making agreeable noises while men explained things poorly. Men had their own burdens. A gentleman was expected to lead the conversation, but never dominate it. His role was to guide discussion gracefully away from anything uncomfortable, like a captain steering through fog. He should flatter without fawning, listen without caring, and use the word indeed as punctuation for any topic he didn't understand. The truly skilled conversationalist could talk for an hour without revealing his occupation, his income, or his soul. Of course, conversation didn't end at the parlour door. It extended into letters, calling cards, and endless social correspondence. Writing a thank you note required as much linguistic choreography as a dinner toast. The Victorians treated words as currency, and wasting them carelessly was a moral failing. Brevity was vulgar, sincerity dangerous. For those with neither wit nor courage, the Victorians devised a charming alternative: parroted cleverness. Memorizing quotations from Shakespeare, Pope, or Tennyson became a way to fake erudition without risk. Dropping a well-timed "as Milton reminds us" could elevate a dull conversation instantly, even if the speaker hadn't actually read Milton and suspected he might be overrated. The science of conversation even entered the classroom. Finishing schools offered courses in elocution, poise, and the correct way to express mild amusement. Women practiced the polite laugh, a delicate trill, no more than 3 seconds long, suitable for any occasion, from bad jokes to near proposals. Men learned how to look thoughtful while not speaking, a skill that made generations of politicians possible. Social gatherings became laboratories of linguistic restraint. In drawing rooms filled with gaslight and nerves, every phrase was examined, measured, and often regretted. A well-timed anecdote could make you the toast of the evening. A misplaced pun could exile you from the guest list. For the newly rich, conversation was the final test of belonging, proof that one could keep pace with the aristocracy without tripping over syntax. Even silence had rules. Awkward pauses were social tragedies, to be smothered instantly with trivial chatter. Many Victorians kept a mental library of backup topics for emergencies: cricket scores, recent funerals, or the weather, in places they'd never visited. A long silence signalled either boredom or scandal, both fatal to reputation. Ironically, the few people who actually enjoyed talking, writers, artists, and philosophers, were viewed with suspicion. Intellectual enthusiasm was considered dangerous, even indecent. Passion belonged to the Continentals. The English preferred understatement so severe it bordered on coma. A gentleman might secretly compose sonnets, but in conversation he'd discuss his dog's temperament instead. And yet, for all its absurdity, this conversational caution served a purpose. It allowed an entire society to coexist in delicate harmony, avoiding the chaos of honesty. The Victorians built an empire of politeness where truth was optional, but manners were mandatory. Small talk kept the peace, a verbal wallpaper covering the cracks of class tension, moral hypocrisy, and human discomfort. The paradox, of course, was that everyone knew the game was hollow. Beneath the layers of civility, Victorians longed for sincerity, for someone to say something real even once, but sincerity was risky and risk was unseemly. So they smiled, nodded, and murmured about the weather, hoping no one would notice the loneliness hiding under the lace. Because in Victorian Britain, conversation wasn't about communication, it was about camouflage, and in that grand, anxious masquerade, the greatest conversationalists were those who could speak for hours and reveal nothing at all. Victorians could turn anything into a symbol of status, including the things that barked, chirped, or photosynthesized. In a society obsessed with appearances, pets and plants weren't simply hobbies, they were props in the theatre of gentility. A well-bred home required more than furniture and manners. It needed living proof that you were civilized enough to care for something delicate, imported, and preferably absurdly expensive. It began with the Victorians' two great passions, classification and control. This was the age of Darwin and taxonomy, when collecting species, animal, vegetable or mineral, was a fashionable substitute for understanding them. A gentleman might not know how to change a tyre on his carriage, but he could name 15 varieties of geranium while sipping sherry. And if he couldn't, his gardener certainly could. The wealthy led the charge with their exotic menageries. Parrots that spoke multiple languages, monkeys that wore waistcoats, peacocks strutting on manicured lawns, all were indispensable accessories in the Victorian arsenal of pretension. Queen Victoria herself kept a veritable zoo at Windsor, inspiring the upper classes to follow suit. Possessing an exotic animal became the ultimate symbol of refinement and empire, proof that one could import not only spices and silks, but sentient curiosities from the colonies. Nothing said I'm cultured like a macaw from Brazil, shrieking obscenities at the vicar. Some families even trained their birds to mimic refined conversation. Parrots that shouted, "How dreadfully middle class," were considered particularly impressive. Monkeys, meanwhile, were kept for their entertainment value, though many households quietly regretted this when they realised monkeys had a sense of humour and no respect for upholstery. Even smaller pets became status statements. Lapdogs, especially pugs, spaniels and toy terriers, were indispensable accessories for ladies of fashion. A tiny, trembling dog on a velvet cushion was the perfect visual shorthand for gentility, fragile, ornamental, and completely useless. Dogs were dressed in miniature coats adorned with ribbons and carried about like handbags that occasionally yapped. It wasn't uncommon for a lady to have her portrait painted with her pet, as if to say, "Look, I nurture things selectively." Cats, meanwhile, clawed their way from superstition to sophistication. Once regarded as sinister or suspicious, they were rehabilitated into emblems of feminine mystery. By the 1880s, cat shows were being held at the Crystal Palace, where proud owners displayed their felines like aristocrats displaying heirlooms. A particularly fluffy Persian could command more admiration than a duchess, but if pets were about prestige, plants were about moral superiority. The Victorian home was a jungle in disguise, drawing rooms packed with ferns, palms and orchids, all arranged to suggest both refinement and spiritual sensitivity. Gardening became a form of competitive virtue. The ability to keep something alive, indoors no less, suggested patience, discipline and good breeding, all qualities the Victorians suspected they were losing. The fern craze, or pteridomania, was the first great horticultural mania of the century. Collecting ferns became an obsession that bordered on the religious. Families took day trips to the countryside to hunt rare specimens, returning with baskets full of greenery and mild cases of heat stroke. Parlours overflowed with fern cases, elaborate glass terrariums designed to protect plants from the unholy trinity of dust, children, and enthusiasm. Some collectors even wrote love poems to their ferns, which one suspects were not reciprocated. Then came the orchid fever, a full-blown epidemic of horticultural hysteria. Orchids, with their fragile beauty and inconvenient need for tropical climates, became the floral equivalent of a foreign accent, alluring, expensive, and slightly untrustworthy. Victorian collectors sent plant hunters into jungles around the world, many of whom never came back. The survivors returned with crates of rare blooms, which were promptly named after their patrons and displayed in greenhouses that cost more to heat than small factories. A single rare orchid could sell for a year's wages, or more if it refused to bloom, which somehow made it even more fashionable. Public flower shows and garden competitions turned this obsession into spectacle. Aristocrats and merchants competed to outdo one another with elaborate displays of roses, lilies, and ego. Gardens became outdoor resumes, sprawling landscapes of wealth and taste. To stroll through one's greenhouse with guests was to perform one's success, each plant a silent testament to moral refinement and disposable income. Even modest homes joined the act. The middle classes filled their windowsills with geraniums, ivy, and aspidistras, the hardy houseplant that became a symbol of middle-class perseverance. A healthy aspidistra told visitors, We may not own an estate, but our roots are stable and our leaves are polished. To neglect a plant was practically a character flaw. Dead foliage suggested moral decay. As always, the Victorians managed to turn sincerity into competition. They published entire manuals on moral botany, books that explained what your choice of plant said about your soul. The rose symbolized purity, the fern humility, and the cactus self-control, presumably because it could survive neglect. For women, tending a plant or pet was seen as practice for domestic virtue. For men, it was a chance to demonstrate scientific curiosity without getting dirt on their gloves. Of course, beneath all the sentimental pruning and pampering, there lurked the same Victorian contradiction, the desire to own nature while pretending to worship it. These were people who extolled the beauty of creation even as they shipped it home in crates, dissected it, and arranged it behind glass. Whether animal or plant, the living world was another possession to be catalogued, displayed, and ultimately controlled. By the end of the century, the homes of the ambitious looked less like residences and more like botanical menageries, ferns creeping across wallpaper, parrots shrieking, cats lounging on embroidered cushions, and owners smiling proudly at the chaos they called cultivation. Because in the Victorian imagination, refinement was measured not by simplicity, but by maintenance. The more fragile your possessions, whether feathered, furred, or floral, the more civilized you appeared. And nothing, absolutely nothing, said good breeding like a parrot that spoke better French than its owner, or a fern so pampered it practically had its own servant. If heaven ran on sincerity, much of Victorian Britain would have been left waiting at the gates. For the Victorians, religion wasn't just faith, it was fashion, the Sunday performance that confirmed your place in the celestial seating chart of society. Church-going became a weekly exhibition of respectability, a holy pageant where salvation took second place to social climbing. The Almighty, it seemed, was less a divine mystery than a convenient audience. By the mid-19th century, religion had become the national costume. The Industrial Revolution had filled cities with wealth, smog, and moral unease. And Victorians soothed their consciences by building churches as quickly as they built factories. In London alone, the skyline sprouted steeples like moral barometers, each one funded by those eager to prove they loved God, or at least didn't love money too much. But attending church was never simply about worship. It was about being seen worshipping. Sunday morning transformed towns into catwalks of piety. Families emerged in their finest clothes, children scrubbed to near transparency, servants marching behind like moral punctuation. The destination didn't matter as much as the procession. To skip church without a doctor's note was social suicide. To attend the wrong one was nearly as bad. In many parishes, pew hierarchy was literally carved into the furniture. Seats closest to the pulpit were rented by the wealthiest families, who could afford both the best acoustics and the moral prestige of proximity to the word. The poor were relegated to the back, or the gallery, if they were lucky, where salvation came with a view of the wealthier souls' hats. Some churches even published pew maps, so newcomers would know their place before they embarrassed themselves by sitting among their betters. Dress, naturally, was part of the liturgy. A lady's bonnet was both a theological and social statement, a delicate balance of modesty and magnificence. Gloves were mandatory. Bare hands suggested either labour or looseness, and a man's waistcoat was expected to convey the gravitas of moral leadership. The Sunday outfit was a sermon in itself, proof that one's prosperity was the reward for upright living and careful laundering. Inside the church, worship was a study in performance. Congregants mastered the art of devout expression, eyes lifted heavenward with just enough moisture to suggest feeling but not hysteria. Hymn singing was another social signal. Too soft and you risked seeming indifferent. Too loud and you were mistaken for evangelical. The truly skilled managed to appear deeply moved while mentally planning the luncheon menu. The sermons themselves were as much moral theatre as theology. Clergymen knew their congregations wanted affirmation, not introspection. Hellfire was acceptable in a moderation, a touch of brimstone to season the homily. But the real purpose was to reinforce respectability. The message was clear. Virtue was good, industry was divine, and God conveniently approved of the middle class. Charity too became a kind of moral currency. The Victorians were passionately philanthropic, but often for all the wrong reasons. Donating to the poor was less about alleviating suffering and more about demonstrating that one wasn't poor. Ladies' charity bazaars sold needlework, preserves, and moral superiority by the jar. Wealthy men funded church repairs and missionary societies as visible proof of righteousness, philanthropy as self-advertisement. Meanwhile, the poor were reminded that their poverty was a test of character. Church sermons often reassured the lower classes that humility and obedience were the surest paths to heaven, conveniently keeping them in place on earth. God loves a cheerful sufferer, preachers intoned, which was easy to say from a cushioned pew. The Sunday ritual extended far beyond the service itself. After church came the promenade, a leisurely stroll through town, allowing the devout to inspect and be inspected. This was where reputations were built and rivalries confirmed. Who wore what? Who looked tired? Who coughed too much during the sermon? Even God couldn't compete with the gossip that followed his worship. Different denominations offered different brands of holiness, each with its own aesthetic. The Anglicans prized formality and good posture. Evangelicals preferred enthusiasm, though only up to a point. High church services dazzled with incense and Latin murmurs, prompting whispers that it all felt a bit too Catholic. Chapel-goers were seen as serious but slightly humorless, while those who stayed home were quietly pitied as souls lost to either atheism or hangover. By the 1880s, religion had evolved into what one historian called the architecture of virtue. Churches themselves were built to impress. Neo-Gothic masterpieces filled with stained glass, marble fonts, and sermons about humility delivered under chandeliers. The sheer grandeur of Victorian churches often distracted from their purpose. Parishioners left feeling morally improved and mildly hungry. Even the clergy weren't immune to ambition. A vicar with a fashionable congregation could become a local celebrity, courted by hostesses and quoted in newspapers. Clerical careers rose and fell with the tides of popularity. Some vicars were chosen less for their theological insight than for their diction and hairline. Preaching, in the right hands, was performance art with eternal implications. And then there were the missionaries' war, Britain's pious export industry. Nothing soothed imperial guilt quite like converting the people you'd just colonised. Missionary societies flourished, sending thousands abroad armed with Bibles, tracts, and a sense of destiny. Back home, donors basked in reflected virtue, saving souls by proxy while enjoying pudding in Kent. Yet beneath all this sanctified splendour, cracks appeared. The rigid moralism of Victorian religion often suffocated genuine faith. As the century progressed, thinkers like Darwin and Huxley rattled the foundations of belief, and more people began to separate religion from respectability. But the performance endured. Going to church remained less a matter of conviction than choreography, one more ritual in the endless dance of appearances, because in the end Victorian religion wasn't about God at all. It was about optics, about being seen to kneel, to donate, to sing, to say. Victorians loved God, particularly when he could be admired from the front row, beneath the stained glass that spelled their names. If the Victorians had a national sport, it wasn't cricket or fox hunting. It was collecting things. Shells, stamps, fossils, butterflies, autographs, coins, postcards, pressed flowers. You name it. Someone in 19th century Britain was categorising it in alphabetical order and displaying it proudly under glass. The Industrial Revolution had filled homes with consumer goods, but it also created a strange new problem: boredom. And so, with characteristic vigour, the Victorians turned leisure into labour, and curiosity into competition. This was the great hobby explosion, a cultural phenomenon that transformed collecting from an idle pastime into a moral duty. A hobby wasn't merely something to pass the time, it was evidence of refinement, discipline, and moral energy. A respectable person couldn't simply relax, they had to catalogue. The roots of the craze lay in the Victorian obsession with order. The age of steam and empire was also the age of sorting, labelling and measuring the world. Science was ascendant, museums were booming, and even leisure had to feel educational. Every drawing room became a miniature British museum, minus the ethics and plus the doilies. Display cabinets were filled with trophies of discovery, the spoils of a society convinced that knowing what things were made you superior to those who didn't. For the aspiring middle class, Hobbies became the perfect marriage of intellect and self-advertisement. Collecting shells showed sensitivity to nature. Collecting fossils suggested a scientific mind and conveniently proved one had been to the seaside. Collecting stamps, the internet of its day, marked you as cosmopolitan, worldly and patient enough to handle glue. Each hobby had its own unspoken social code. The butterfly craze was particularly feverish. Inspired by the naturalist explorers who filled the newspapers with tales of discovery, amateur entomologists set out armed with nets, pins, and boundless self-importance. The sight of grown men chasing insects through fields in top hats became so common that rural children learned to identify collectors by sound, the flapping of coattails followed by a triumphant "aha!" Butterflies were captured, killed, and mounted in neat symmetrical frames, beauty frozen in moral order. Having a butterfly case on your wall announced that you were not only cultured, but capable of disciplining nature. Meanwhile, the fossil frenzy reached geologic proportion. After the discoveries of Mary Anning and the rise of geology as a respectable science, every self-respecting Briton fancied themselves an amateur paleontologist. Beaches and cliffs were stripped of ammonites by collectors who wouldn't have known a trilobite from a turnip, but loved the idea of understanding the ancient world. Fossils made ideal conversation pieces, especially for people who enjoyed disagreeing about whether they contradicted Genesis. Owning a few prehistoric specimens signalled a mind open to science, though not so open as to lose one's pew in church. Even stamp collecting, or philately, as its devotees called it, because plain English was never fashionable, became a full-blown social movement. The first postage stamp, the penny black of 1840, had barely circulated before people began hoarding it. By the 1860s, catalogues, clubs and exhibitions had turned postage into prestige. Stamp albums became the Victorian equivalent of social media profiles, tidy, colourful and carefully curated to suggest worldliness. A well-arranged album said, "I am disciplined, curious, and almost certainly insufferable at dinner." Women, too, found their own ways into the hobby economy. Shell collections, scrapbooks and pressed flower albums were considered suitably feminine outlets for curiosity. These projects allowed ladies to demonstrate both artistry and restraint, transforming nature into decoration without the scandal of scientific ambition. The more delicate the arrangement, the more it whispered of moral refinement. A woman who preserves flowers, one etiquette guide insisted, preserves also her purity. One suspects the flowers felt differently. But hobbies weren't limited to nature. The Victorians could make a hobby out of anything. Autograph collecting became fashionable among social climbers who equated ink with intimacy. Newspaper editors received desperate letters begging for signatures of anyone even mildly famous. One woman reportedly fainted after acquiring Charles Dickens's autograph, which in fairness probably wasn't unique behaviour around Dickens. The curio cabinet became the throne room of this new leisure empire. Polished mahogany cases housed seashells, minerals, taxidermy, and whatever else could be stuffed, labelled or pinned. Visitors were expected to admire these collections while pretending to care. Hosts would gesture toward a dusty ammonite or a moth wing and say, "Ah yes, that one I obtained near Lyme Regis," as though they'd personally discovered evolution between tea and toast. Public institutions joined the mania. The opening of the Great Exhibition of 1851, the world's largest display of stuff, only intensified the craze. Millions flocked to the Crystal Palace to gawk at artefacts from every corner of the empire, confirming that collecting was both patriotic and profitable. If Queen Victoria could admire a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, surely the average subject could collect pigeon feathers. What made these hobbies uniquely Victorian was their moral veneer. They weren't indulgences, they were improvements. Collecting taught patience, observation and restraint, all qualities that separated the refined from the reckless. Children were encouraged to begin early, with toy microscopes and junior specimen kits. Better to pin a beetle, one children's manual advised, than waste an afternoon in idleness. Somewhere between moral instruction and mild sadism, an entire generation learned to equate virtue with organisation. Of course, competition was inevitable. Collectors boasted, traded, and occasionally sabotaged one another's displays. Amateur societies sprang up, complete with meetings, minutes, and mutual resentment. A well-to-do gentleman might attend a naturalist club to discuss recent discoveries, though everyone knew the real goal was to compare glass cases and egos. Some even hired artists to enhance their specimens, the Victorian equivalent of retouching your Instagram photos. By the century's end, homes across Britain were drowning in evidence of earnest curiosity. Parlours groaned under the weight of shells, insects, fossils and rocks, while owners smiled with the satisfaction of having conquered boredom through bureaucracy. The great hobby explosion had done its work. It gave the restless middle class something to catalogue, the wealthy something to brag about, and the lonely something to alphabetise. Because in Victorian Britain, even leisure couldn't be lazy. Every shell had to be labelled, every butterfly pinned, every fossil justified. Hobbies weren't just amusements. They were resumes in disguise, proof that beneath the lace and propriety, the great British soul remained forever busy, forever collecting, and forever competing for the moral high ground. In the grand social masquerade of Victorian Britain, nothing shouted, "I've made it," louder than someone else doing all your shouting for you. Servants were not merely workers, they were human status symbols, animated furniture designed to move silently, polish visibly, and reflect the glow of their employer's success. The British class system was a pyramid, but Victorians made sure it was one-staffed from base to tip, with liveried figures supporting their masters' illusions of superiority. By the mid-19th century, domestic service was Britain's largest single occupation. 1 in every 3 women and countless men worked as servants. But for the genteel, the goal wasn't just to have servants, it was to be seen having them. The wealthy turned their domestic staff into part of their public persona. A large household wasn't a mark of inefficiency, it was a declaration of victory over poverty, labour, and basic tasks. It began at the front door. The butler, that walking embodiment of quiet disdain, was the first and finest ornament of the home. His polished shoes, solemn posture, and sepulchral voice lent an air of gravity to even the smallest doorway. A well-trained butler could convey a lifetime of judgment in a single eyebrow. He was the gatekeeper of respectability, deciding which guests crossed the threshold and which were politely frozen out. Behind him, the footmen, taller, younger, and often selected for their looks, served as ornamental proof that one's household could afford aesthetic labour. Uniforms mattered immensely. Every servant's attire was carefully curated to mirror the master's social ambition. Footmen gleamed in powdered wigs and plush livery trimmed with silver or gold. Coachmen wore top hats and cockades. Housemaids donned crisp aprons and discreet expressions. Each uniform was a mobile advertisement of the family's prosperity. Servants didn't just serve, they performed wealth, and nowhere was this performance more visible than in the carriage parade. In Victorian cities and fashionable resorts, the afternoon carriage drive was a social ritual of astonishing absurdity. Families would take to the streets not for transportation but for display. Rolling exhibitions of privilege. Horses gleamed. Carriages shone, and servants perched proudly and uncomfortably at attention. The real audience wasn't the passengers inside, but the people watching from the pavement. The carriages themselves were ranked as meticulously as their owners. The landau suggested refinement. The brougham whispered practicality with polish. The phaeton, a dangerously lightweight 2-horse carriage, screamed arrogance and a death wish. But regardless of model, the number and appearance of servants mattered most. Having 2 footmen behind the carriage was ideal. 1 was acceptable, none was unthinkable. A servant's posture during these outings was a matter of near theological importance. The perfect footman stood upright, motionless and expressionless, even if the wind tried to blow him into the next county. His gloves had to be spotless. His boots mirror-shined, his gaze fixed nobly ahead. An ill-timed sneeze could ruin an entire family's afternoon reputation. Inside the house, servants continued the performance of invisible grandeur. Dinner parties unfolded like choreographed ballets. Butlers commanding silent battalions of waiters, maids gliding between courses like ghosts of good manners. The smoothness of service was itself a mark of status. To see how elegantly a household ran was to measure how firmly its master controlled his microcosm of the world. Servants were expected to embody the virtues their employers liked to claim: obedience, humility, precision, without ever reflecting too much of their humanity. In Victorian etiquette, a good servant was described in the same language used for furniture: steady, polished, but reliable. Their invisibility was the ultimate compliment. When things went right, they disappeared. When things went wrong, they materialized only to be blamed. Still, hierarchy ruled even below stairs. Domestic pyramid existed within the larger one. The butler ruled over the male staff, the housekeeper over the female, and everyone else existed in a tense ecology of obedience and gossip. The cook held special power, her temperament capable of toppling entire dinner parties. Footmen and scullery-maids existed several moral universes apart, yet were united in mutual exhaustion. The household was a microcosm of empire, discipline above, endless labour below, and the illusion of harmony holding it all together. For employers, maintaining such a staff was ruinously expensive, but financial ruin was preferable to social shame. The middle classes, desperate to appear grand, often bankrupted themselves employing servants they didn't need. A modest family might hire a maid-of-all-work simply to prove they weren't sliding into obscurity. Respectability, after all, required the ability to outsource your drudgery. The more useless your servant's duties, the higher your standing. Having a man whose job was only to polish doorknobs was a mark of true gentility. Servants themselves became unwilling mirrors of their master's pretensions. They learned to mimic genteel speech, to carry themselves with dignity, to understand which fork belonged where long before their employers did. Many knew their employers' secrets, financial, romantic, or otherwise, but kept silent, wielding discretion as their only form of power. In many households, the butler or housekeeper was the true keeper of order, maintaining peace between appearances and reality. The public spectacle of service reached its height during grand events, weddings, balls, or royal visits, when entire staffs were paraded like regiments. Servants lined the entrance halls, bowed in synchronized humility, and vanished once their part was done. Newspapers even reported on particularly distinguished households, noting not only the guest list but the number of staff in attendance. To be known for one's servants was as important as being known for one's morals, but by the twilight of the 19th century, this glittering hierarchy began to creak. Industrialization created new ways to show wealth: electric lights, automobiles, telephones, and young workers started abandoning service for better-paying factory jobs. The servant shortage became a national crisis, lamented in editorials as if civilization itself might collapse without someone to starch the collars. The spectacle faded, but the longing for deference lingered. For decades, the British elite had built their respectability on the backs of those who made it look effortless. Every polished boot, every folded napkin, every motionless coachman was a silent sermon on hierarchy. Servants were not just the machinery of comfort, they were the scenery of status. Because in the Victorian world, it wasn't enough to be wealthy or respectable. You had to stage it, and nothing staged it quite like a butler at the door, a footman on the carriage, and a world pretending that invisible labour was the purest form of elegance. In Victorian Britain, society ran not on steam or silver, but on paper. Specifically, the calling card. A mere 3 by 2 inches of stiff cream-coloured cardstock held the power to open doors, forge alliances, and accidentally annihilate reputations. It was the ultimate symbol of social navigation, a miniature passport to respectability, diplomacy, and disaster. To the uninitiated, it looked absurdly simple. A small rectangle bearing one's name, sometimes embossed, occasionally perfumed and often delivered by someone else entirely. But behind that modest piece of stationery lay an intricate language of status and subtext, a world where how you handed someone your card said more about you than your entire conversation ever could. The calling card system evolved from 18th century visiting traditions, but by the Victorian age, it had metastasized into an art form, half etiquette, half espionage. Every respectable household maintained a tray, usually of silver or porcelain, by the front door. On it rested the day's offerings, cards from visitors, acquaintances and opportunists, stacked like social fossils. One glance could reveal who was courting favour, who was still relevant, and who had overplayed their hand. The butler, that gatekeeper of gossip, knew them all. A card was more than an introduction. It was a gesture of intent. Leaving your card signalled that you wished to initiate or maintain a relationship. To fail to leave one after a social call was tantamount to ghosting in lace gloves, but it had to be done correctly. Arriving in person and handing your card directly to your host was considered too forward. You were supposed to leave it discreetly, often with a servant, as if to say, "I desire your acquaintance, but not enough to risk conversation." Every detail mattered. The quality of the cardstock, the engraving, the thickness, even the corners, all carried coded meaning. Smooth, heavy card with raised lettering said old money. Thin, cheap cardstock hinted tradesman. Folded corners were a whole dialect of their own. A turned down right corner meant you'd called in person. The left indicated a card left for all members of the family. A folded top corner suggested congratulations. A folded bottom corner condolences. The uninitiated were as likely to offend as to impress. One wrong fold could mark you as socially illiterate. Introductions were the currency of advancement, and calling cards were their receipts. You could not simply meet someone new, a heaven forbid. Proper introduction required mediation. If Lady Waverley thought you respectable enough, she might present your card to Mrs. Fanshawe, who would then decide whether to acknowledge you. If she sent her own card in return, congratulations, you had entered her orbit. If she didn't, the silence was deafening. In the genteel battlefield of society, not responding was the polite equivalent of assassination. Men and women operated within slightly different card economies. Gentlemen's cards were typically smaller and more austere, plain lettering, no decoration, befitting their supposed gravitas. Ladies' cards, on the other hand, flirted with the boundaries of design. Delicate borders, flowing script, sometimes even embossed flowers or gilt edges. A woman's calling card was her social fate, graceful, restrained, and utterly without evidence of effort. A smudge, an ink blot, or, heaven forbid, a stain could destroy the illusion of composure. Cards didn't merely open doors, they maintained distance. A lady might return a gentleman's card to signal polite disinterest, or leave it untouched to suggest he had overstepped. Married women wielded them like shields. A card could be used to deflect unwanted attentions without the indignity of a scene. And because everyone's social circle was constantly shifting, card trays became barometers of standing. Too few cards meant neglect. Too many meant desperation. These most enviable houses had trays so overflowing that guests imagined the occupants must be exhausted from refusing company. Visiting hours, or at-homes, were another essential part of the ritual. Ladies announced in advance when they would be at home to receive visitors, and calling cards functioned as RSVP, attendance record, and thank you note all at once. Arriving unannounced or outside the published window was an act of barbarism worthy of the colonies. Etiquette books stressed the precision of timing, never earlier than 3, never later than 5, and for no longer than 20 minutes. Longer visits were considered clingy or possibly medical emergencies. The choreography of exchange could reach absurd levels. Imagine this. You send your card to Mrs. Wentworth. She returns hers, signalling approval. You then call at her house but find she's not at home. A polite lie, meaning she is absolutely at home but does not wish to see you. You leave another card anyway. Days later, her footman delivers her card again, folded to indicate she called in person, which she didn't. The entire affair has involved no actual human interaction, but congratulations, you now share a cordial understanding. Servants, inevitably, became the true masters of this silent diplomacy. They managed deliveries, sorted cards, and interpreted the coded hieroglyphs for their bewildered employers. Many a social scandal was born in the servants' hall, where misplaced cards became subjects of whispered glee. A butler who dropped a card in the wrong tray could spark feuds that lasted entire seasons. And speaking of feuds, stationery mistakes could destroy lives. Sending the wrong card to the wrong person, failing to reciprocate, or the ultimate sin, handing your card directly to someone clearly your superior could earn you a reputation as gauche for years. Etiquette manuals warned readers to practice card etiquette the way soldiers practiced marksmanship. Social success depended on precision. Even the death of someone required careful paper choreography. A black border on a card signalled mourning, its thickness indicating the depth of grief, or at least the depth one wished others to believe. Some mourners grew so attached to their black-bordered stationery that they continued using it long after the loss, just to remind society of their enduring sorrow and taste. By the late Victorian era, entire industries revolved around these delicate tokens. Engravers, printers, paper suppliers, and delivery services profited from the obsession. Calling cards became so integral to social life that some people employed clerks just to manage them, the analogue equivalent of curating one's social media feed. And in a way, that's exactly what the calling card was, the Instagram of the 19th century. Carefully crafted, meticulously filtered, and always meant to be seen by others, never actually used for communication. Behind every card lay vanity, ambition, and a deep fear of exclusion, proof that in Victorian Britain, identity could fit neatly on a 2-inch rectangle. Because friendships might begin with conversation, but reputations began with cardstock. And one misplaced card, one tiny rectangle of social ambition gone astray, could topple an entire house of manners faster than gossip ever could. If virtue were a business in Victorian Britain, it would have been listed on the London Stock Exchange, and its dividends paid in reputation. The 19th century didn't just industrialise goods, it industrialised goodness. Charity, philanthropy, moral crusades all became a kind of social currency, transforming kindness into a public performance and benevolence into branding. To be good wasn't about compassion, it was about visibility. Victorian society loved morality almost as much as it loved hypocrisy. The same empire that filled its factories with children and its colonies with exploitation also filled its drawing rooms with talk of uplift, virtue, and Christian duty. The rich didn't just want to be wealthy, they wanted to appear righteous, and so, out of soot and sermons, a new cultural industry was born. Philanthropy as performance, charity was fashionable, but it was also strategic, soothed the conscience while polishing the image. The act of giving became less about alleviating suffering and more about being witnessed giving. Philanthropy was a mirror that reflected not the faces of the poor, but the vanity of the giver. As one cynical observer wrote in 1865, the Englishman does not so much love his neighbour as love being thought to love him. Public giving reached operatic levels of theatre. Charity balls became the highlight of the social calendar, glittering affairs where silks and jewels shone brighter than virtue itself. Ladies in diamonds raised money for orphans they'd never meet, while gentlemen pledged sums between waltzes, careful to bid generously enough to seem moral, but not so much as to appear nouveau riche. The irony was exquisite. Wealth earned from factories that crushed workers was paraded as compassion for their widows. The greater the guilt, the grander the ballroom. Newspapers covered these events in lavish detail, listing the names of attendees and the amounts donated, the 19th century equivalent of a top donors leaderboard. To appear in print as a benefactor was to achieve the highest form of social salvation. Anonymity was admirable in theory, but no one wanted to risk it. As one etiquette manual gently reminded readers, discretion in generosity is divine, but recognition ensures further generosity. Translation: no one donates quietly if applause is available. This obsession with moral visibility produced an army of philanthropic celebrities. Figures like Angela Burdett Coutts, one of the richest women in Britain, made headlines for her vast donations to hospitals, housing projects, and animal welfare. Her generosity was real, but so was her fame. She was the Victorian equivalent of a saint with a publicist. Similarly, the reformer Lord Shaftesbury used his tireless campaigns for child labour laws to embody Christian virtue and cement his legacy as the moral conscience of England. The age adored its do-gooders as long as they were photogenic in oil paint. For the ambitious middle classes, philanthropy was the ultimate social escalator. A merchant who donated a park, a library, or a hospital could launder his origins faster than any etiquette book. Public virtue disguised private vulgarity. Every new chapel, orphanage, or drinking fountain bore the engraved name of its benefactor, proof that moral purity could, in fact, be bought by the square inch. Victorian streets became forests of commemorative plaques, each declaring, "I help the poor and please don't forget it." But the philanthropy machine wasn't limited to money. There were moral crusades for every temperament. The temperance movement turned abstaining from alcohol into a public badge of honour, while anti-gambling leagues, purity societies and rescue missions for fallen women sprouted across Britain like moral mushrooms after a rainstorm. Many were sincere, others were opportunities to lecture strangers while feeling saintly. Respectable ladies ran Magdalene homes to reform prostitutes, all while ignoring the economic realities that forced women into such work. The Victorians weren't hypocrites by accident, they were professionals at it. At the same time, public donations became a form of civic one-upmanship. Cities competed for whose benefactors were the most benevolent. Manchester had its libraries, Birmingham its institutes, London its museums. Every new cultural building was both an act of charity and a monument to its donor's ego. The Industrial Revolution had created fortunes faster than anyone knew how to morally justify them. So the newly rich did the next best thing. They built monuments to forgiveness. Women, constrained by the walls of propriety, found in philanthropy one of the few socially acceptable outlets for influence. Charity work allowed them to exert moral authority without appearing political. Running a charity bazaar or serving on a benevolent committee let them flex organisational skill under the disguise of sentimentality. The Angel of Mercy became a standard female role model, compassionate, tireless, and conveniently non-threatening. Philanthropy gave women power in a world that otherwise demanded they faint gracefully on couches. Still, for all the glitter and sermonising, Victorian charity was steeped in contradiction. The poor were both pitied and distrusted, the recipients of aid and the subjects of endless moral scrutiny. The wealthy insisted that help must come with character building, meaning lectures, rules, and proof of good behaviour. Deserving poor became a category invented to ease guilt, separating those suitably humble from those inconveniently human. Charity might have been generous, but it was never equal. Even philanthropy had a dress code. Respectable benevolence required decorum, pity without proximity. True suffering was unsightly. The fashionable philanthropists preferred their poor sanitised and safely distant, preferably represented by a subscription list or a watercolour illustration. Nothing disturbed moral self-advertisement like the reality of the thing being advertised. And yet the system worked, socially, if not spiritually. Philanthropy became the lubricant of the Victorian machine. It allowed the rich to feel pure, the poor to stay grateful, and everyone to continue believing that Britain was not a country of contradictions but of conscience. In the end, the The Victorian moral makeover wasn't about being good. It was about appearing good while remaining comfortable. Charity became theatre, compassion, choreography. A well-timed donation could buy forgiveness, admiration, and a headline. Because in Victorian Britain, virtue wasn't its own reward. Virtue was receipt-based, and the more ornate your receipt, the more respectable your soul. For all its lace, manners, and moral sermons, Victorian society was built on one great illusion, that everyone knew their place. Yet the era's obsession with class and respectability made it the perfect breeding ground for those who didn't have a place, so they invented one. If the Victorians worshipped appearance, then the boldest among them learned to weaponize it. Titles could be faked, fortunes exaggerated, and ancestry entirely fabricated. And in a world where pretense passed for virtue, the greatest sin wasn't lying, it was getting caught. By the mid-19th century, the lines between old and new money were already blurring. The aristocracy looked tired, the industrialists were getting richer, and the newly respectable were desperate to disguise their beginnings in soot and commerce. The result was a society so enamoured with pretense that fraud became a form of performance art. One of the most famous cases was Sir Francis Drake, no relation to the original. This enterprising impostor claimed descent from the Elizabethan sea hero, parading his supposed lineage at dinner parties while subtly soliciting investments in bogus colonial schemes. For years he mingled comfortably among the gentry until someone checked his coat of arms and found it borrowed, literally cut from a library illustration. When exposed, he vanished overnight, leaving behind unpaid debts and the memorable comment, "I merely told society what it wanted to hear." He wasn't wrong. Victorians wanted to believe. The empire was obsessed with genealogy. Every respectable household boasted a family Bible, not for scripture but for lineage entries. Nobility was a social currency that could still outspend money, so naturally the market flooded with counterfeits. Heraldic registries overflowed with spurious claims. Countless descendants of Plantagenets appeared from nowhere, armed with newly engraved rings and suspiciously French handwriting. Forgeries weren't confined to family trees. There were title inflationists, minor gentry who quietly upgraded themselves from Mr. to Baronet or Viscount the moment they moved towns. Newspapers occasionally reported imposters of high breeding who arrived in rural parishes, rented grand houses, and held balls before disappearing, often with borrowed silverware. In a world where letters of introduction counted for more than passports, a steady hand and a good tailor could buy a temporary kingdom. The women were no less audacious. The Madame Rachel scandal in the 1860s remains legendary. Rachel Levison, a beauty entrepreneur in London, sold magnetic youth creams to society ladies, claiming to be descended from European nobility. Her salon promised transformation, not just of the face but of class itself. She hosted duchesses and debutantes, flattering them with aristocratic gossip, while peddling her potions at ruinous prices. When the truth emerged, her ancestry was pure fiction, her products mostly lard and perfume. She was tried for fraud. Her clients were humiliated not by the scam, but by the revelation that they'd believed it. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms across Britain, a quieter form of impersonation thrived: the social fabrication. Middle-class men reinvented themselves as landed gentlemen, with estates that existed only in conversation. Women from modest backgrounds claimed distant cousins in the peerage, sometimes inventing entire genealogical branches to justify invitations to grander homes. One woman in Bath introduced herself as Lady Eleanor Smythe, a title she borrowed from her employer's stationery. She attended luncheons, gave recitals, and was only exposed when someone spotted her serving tea at the same address she claimed to own. Even the colonies played their part. Returning travellers spun extravagant tales of plantations and estates in Jamaica, conveniently forgetting to mention that their wealth came from trade or railways. In a society obsessed with breeding, money without ancestry was a moral embarrassment. And so the Victorians invented both, occasionally in the same sentence. The newspapers adored these scandals. The Victorian press fed on stories of imposters like a cat on cream, relishing every detail of deception. Fraud was entertainment wrapped in moral outrage. A forged title, a false inheritance, a pretended marriage, all served as cautionary tales about the dangers of ambition, though secretly everyone admired the audacity. Because, after all, wasn't all of society pretending? Even the most respectable households participated in softer forms of deceit. Families quietly rewrote their histories, erasing inconvenient relatives, a bankrupt uncle here, a scandalous aunt there. The rise of genealogical printing allowed these edited family records to appear official. The result, an entire generation of Victorians who genuinely believed their grandfathers were minor nobility, when in reality they were minor criminals. Some pretenders went beyond fabrication into full psychological immersion. The notorious Princess Caraboo case of the early 19th century foreshadowed the Victorian mania for imposture. A young woman appeared in an English village speaking an invented language, claiming to be a royal from a distant island. Scholars, clergymen, and society ladies all fell for it. Her exotic manners, flowing garments, and mysterious speech proved irresistible to an audience already primed to worship novelty wrapped in nobility. When the hoax unravelled, her defenders insisted she had the spirit of a princess, if not the lineage. It was the perfect Victorian defence. Sincerity mattered less than presentation. By the late 1800s, as fortunes multiplied and titled families went broke, the boundary between real and pretend aristocracy became almost impossible to define. A newly minted industrialist could buy an estate, adopt a crest, and host a ball attended by dukes, and no one dared question it, because questioning it made everyone nervous. The upper crust needed pretenders as much as pretenders needed them. They were mirrors reflecting each other's delusions. The moral of these stories wasn't lost on anyone. The Victorians, masters of appearances, were hoisted by their own velvet petards. In a world obsessed with class signals, accent, dress, manners, address, truth had no market value. The real scandal wasn't that imposters existed, but that they thrived for so long. The system that prized illusion invited illusionists, and many of them succeeded far better than they ever planned. Some climbed so high they forgot which lies they'd told at the bottom. Because in the Great Victorian Masquerade, authenticity was optional, but style was everything. By the time Queen Victoria's long and lace-covered reign finally ended in 1901, the great social pyramid she had presided over was already wobbling. The stiff hierarchies, the endless etiquette manuals, the obsession with who sat where and who wore what, all were beginning to look as antique as a stuffed parlour fern. For nearly a century, Britain had lived by the rule that appearances could save your soul. But as the 20th century dawned, the old ladder of pretense began to splinter beneath the weight of progress. The Industrial Revolution, that unstoppable steam-powered social blender, had already done the unthinkable. It had made mobility possible. The newly rich industrialists of the mid-19th century had clawed their way into drawing rooms once reserved for dukes and viscounts. By the late Victorian era, their children were marrying into the very aristocracy that had once sniffed at them. The irony was delicious. The same families who once mocked trade were now living off it through strategic matrimony. Titles and money were merging like railways, clumsy at first, but ultimately inevitable. The aristocracy, once untouchable, began to creak like a chandelier under too much guilt. Maintaining estates the size of small countries was expensive, and agricultural decline meant that centuries of inherited wealth were evaporating faster than port at a hunting dinner. Suddenly, dukes and earls found themselves land-rich but cash-poor, forced to rent out their ballrooms for charity bazaars or, the ultimate indignity, open them to the public. One peer famously complained, "We are reduced to showing the mob the furniture our ancestors died acquiring." The age of secrecy had given way to the age of spectacle. Meanwhile, industrial wealth gleamed brighter than any coat of arms. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham and Glasgow were filled with self-made men whose fortunes dwarfed those of many noble families. The old elite could sneer at factory smoke all they wanted. It now paid their daughters dowries. Across Britain, the social script was being rewritten. Breeding mattered less than business, and manners were giving way to money as the national badge of success. The butlers still bowed, but increasingly they were bowing to accountants. The late Victorians had also discovered something the early Victorians feared. Mobility wasn't just vertical anymore. Trains, telegrams, and tourism had shrunk the world. One could travel from London to Paris in hours, and from obscurity to notoriety even faster. The middle class, once desperate to look genteel, began developing its own identity, proud of its productivity, its industry, its modernity. By the time Edward VII took the throne, the tone of society had shifted. People no longer whispered trade like an insult, they said it with envy. The new Edwardian world was louder, looser, and far less patient with hypocrisy. The old performance of virtue, the moral posing, the rigid decorum, felt out of step with a society powered by electricity and self-confidence. The phrase self-made man, once a polite fiction, became a boast. The middle class, once aspiring to emulate the aristocracy, now found itself defining respectability on its own terms. Instead of pretending to be noble, it pretended to be modern, and for once that pretense actually matched the times. Even the household hierarchy was shifting. Servant shortages plagued upper-class homes as young people fled domestic service for factory work or office jobs. The invisible army that had polished boots and poured tea was disappearing. Mechanical conveniences, gas lighting, indoor plumbing, the first vacuum cleaners, replaced hands that once scrubbed floors. The great machine of deference was losing its gears. A butler might still exist, but increasingly he was more relic than requirement. With the loosening of class came the loosening of manners. Formal visiting declined, calling cards collected dust, and the endless choreography of polite deceit gave way to something far more terrifying: casual conversation. Dinner parties became less about displaying cutlery and more about debating politics, art, or the latest scandal from the music halls. The Victorians had built an empire on restraint. Their descendants began dismantling it with small talk. The press, too, democratized scandal. Newspapers and illustrated magazines dragged high society into the public eye. And once the curtain was lifted, everyone saw that the upper crust was as cracked as the teacups. Affairs, bankruptcies, and divorces, once whispered about behind fans, were printed in bold type. The public learned that the nobility could behave as badly as anyone else, only with better table settings. Respectability began to lose its magic when everyone realised how much of it had been smoke and mirrors. Even philanthropy started to evolve from theatre to institution. Instead of charity balls and sentimental sermons, late Victorian reformers began founding organisations with genuine social purpose. Housing trusts, schools, unions, suffrage groups. The performance of caring gave way, slowly, unevenly, to actual care. It turned out that helping the poor worked better when you didn't charge admission. And then came the great equaliser, the 20th century itself. The First World War shattered what was left of the social order. Titles, etiquette, and ancestry mattered little in the trenches. Soldiers who had once been butlers fought beside men who might have employed them. After that, returning home to polish silver or arrange calling cards felt absurd. The war didn't just kill millions, it murdered the illusion of permanence that the Victorians had spent a century perfecting. When the dust settled, Britain had changed irreversibly. Women had entered the workforce, the vote was expanding, and entire classes of people discovered they no longer needed permission to exist. The new society valued wit over lineage, hustle over heritage. Even the aristocracy, those who survived both war and taxes, had to reinvent themselves as landlords, politicians, or, in particularly desperate cases, reality show ancestors. The ladder still existed, but it wasn't made of mahogany anymore. It was networked. By the early 20th century, Success depended less on birth and more on connections, charm and timing. Social climbing had evolved into social networking. The performance of refinement became the performance of relevance. You no longer needed a title to matter. Just an invitation or a business card or later, a telegram with the right name on it. And yet, for all the progress, some things never changed. The new century might have traded corsets for confidence and hierarchies for hustling, but the British instinct for pretense proved immortal. The costumes grew looser, but the show went on. Because whether it was 1850 or 1910, silk or smartphone, one rule endured. Everyone, everywhere, still wanted to look like they belonged, even if they had to pretend to do it. By the 20th century, social climbing was out. Social networking was in, only the dress code stayed expensive.